Thank you for downloading the book from the free electronic library royallib.iu, http://royallib.iu. All books by the author, http://royallib.iu/author/Starikov_Nikolai.html. The same book in other formats, http://royallib.iu/book/Starikovi_Nikolai/Ukraina_house_revolutia_orужие_dollara.html. Enjoy reading. Nikolai Starikov. Ukraine, chaos and revolution are the weapon of the dollar. Introduction. Geopolitics in action. Attack on the Russian world. If you are not interested in politics, then politics will be interested in you. The truth of this bitter saying is confirmed once again. The end of 2013 and the first half of 2014 awakened millions of people from political hibernation. They lived their own lives. They loved, raised children, made plans and hoped for the best. But their hopes were not destined to come true. Big politics has rudely burst into the lives of those who have never been interested in even small politics. Burst near the borders of Russia. Ukraine is part of our people, part of the Russian world. At first, this arrival of geopolitics on the street looked like a show. It's a little fun and lively, and many people went there to make money or just visit. A repeat of 2004, a new Maidan. But then it became completely sad, burning policemen and Bacot fighters, militants with bats and in chains. Geopolitics has come into the life of an ordinary person wearing a mask. A face in a mask is the symbol of the political season 2013 to 2014. And then it got scary. Then the pictures of February 1917 suddenly came to life on TV screens. Anarchy, the dissolution of law enforcement, violence on the streets, nightly visits to the apartments of those who behaved incorrectly during the revolution. Events moved with terrible speed. 2 months later, the eerie pictures of the Great Patriotic War began to come to life. People burned and tortured by executioners in Odessa. Killed in Mariupol, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Geopolitics is the competition between great powers for control of resources. That's the whole point. This struggle is endless and has neither end nor beginning. This is a colossal chess in which moves are made by armies, parties, and exchange rates. Human life was never valued in this game. The Russian world is one of the main players in this game. Let's not be players, let's become objects of the game. It is impossible to get away, which is why it is so important to understand the rules of the game, its meaning, and see your opponents. And consider them precisely rivals, and not partners. You can call it whatever you like, but the essence should not be lost. They want to destroy the Russian world, the unique Russian civilization. At a minimum, weaken, at a maximum, remake, change our code and our values. War is a way of gaining influence on the planet, which our partners have mastered perfectly. But it's best to fight with someone else's hands, to drag Russia into a war that it doesn't need. To pit two parts of one people against each other. They have already done this in India, dividing it into two parts, India and Pakistan. And these two states fought with each other, as did the Serbs, Croats and Bosniaks. When they were together they had a big and strong Yugoslavia. Now there are fragments that do not have a sovereign policy. We must understand, what happened in Ukraine has very specific organizers and a very specific goal. The goal is to bury the memory of Russia's victories and finally resolve the Russian issue. Just so we wouldn't exist. Chapter 1. Who is the customer of Euromaidan? Russia's new policy began with Ukraine. December 23, 2013. Significant events very often pass unnoticed by ordinary people busy with their daily lives. Someone in October 1917 did not notice the Bolsheviks taking power, immersed in their personal concerns. Someone in the days of August 1991 did not notice the collapse of their country, disguised as a putsch. So today, before our eyes, Russia has changed the formula of its foreign policy. Russia's new policy began with Ukraine. After the treacherous liquidation of Russia-USSR as a geopolitical player by Gorbachev and his accomplices, our country for a long time did not have its own foreign policy, the prominent representative of which was Foreign Minister Kozyrev. He agreed to everything, always said yes to any actions of the United States and the West. As a matter of fact, the foreign policy of modern Russia appeared only under Putin. Before this, the greatest achievement could only be gestures, the march of Russian paratroopers to Pristina, thanks to Yunusbek Evkirov, the current head of Ingushetia. The turn of Prime Minister Primakov's plane over the Atlantic in response to the start of the bombing of Yugoslavia. Russia began defending its own interests, not American or European ones, in the 2000s. First, by establishing order and eliminating terrorist gangs in the Caucasus, then by not supporting US aggression against Iraq. In 2013, we already observed a whole series of foreign policy successes for our country, Snowden, Syria, Ukraine. These successes today are not disputed even by those who previously wore white ribbons, and today do not want to become a laughingstock by denying obvious things. Access to secret data of the Pentagon, CIA and State Department, expansion of influence in the Middle East, additional contracts for the supply of weapons to Arab countries, contracts for oil and gas production. Russia received new agreements on aircraft and shipbuilding in Ukraine, contracts on nuclear energy. Rosatom is intensively building nuclear power plants around the world, and help from Ukrainian enterprises would not hurt, plus the exclusion of NATO bases in Ukraine. Another plus is the quiet return of the Iskanders to combat lines right on the borders of the European Union. Our European and American partners received, as a consolation, the exhausted Euromaidan and savings on air tickets for the leaders of European countries who, not being able to directly declare a boycott of the Olympics in Sochi, simply do not go there, expressing their protest against the measure of the quick actions of Putin's diplomacy. However, 2013 was not only a year of significant successes in our diplomacy. The essence of Russian foreign policy has changed radically. We moved from defense to attack. Of course, we mean both defense and attack of a diplomatic nature. Previously, all Russian actions in this area were defensive. Let's take Syria for example. The fact that Russia did not allow the states to destroy Syrian statehood is obvious to everyone today. How did we do it? In different ways: arms supplies, diplomatic support, other special assistance. But it was always a reaction to the moves of our partners. They begin to finance and arm peaceful protesters. We help Assad. They are preparing an invasion. Russian warships come to Syria and stand between NATO ships and the Syrian coast. Our partners will start shooting at Syria. The air defense of Russian ships will shoot down missiles as a threat to the safety of combat units of our fleet. The Marines landed in Tartus. If a mess breaks out there and Western special forces land in the form of peaceful demonstrators on the shore, our Marines will simply be obliged to take measures to restore order around the base in order to ensure the safety of the Russian fleet. The measures are different, but it is always a reaction to the opponent's actions, a move in response to the move of another chess player. This was the case with Snowden. Russia, in response to his arrival, having received certain guarantees from him, gave him the opportunity to disappear into its open spaces. We didn't recruit him and take him out, he asked to come to us. The West is accustomed to Russian foreign policy consisting of retaliatory threats that never become reality because the West itself abandons its own steps. And in the situation with Ukraine, everything changed overnight. Russia went on the offensive for the first time. Instead of taking action to block the EU and US steps to take away sovereignty from our neighbors, the Kremlin for the first time moved beyond demonstrating threats. He put into action what he had previously only threatened. And this turned out to be a complete surprise for Washington and Brussels. Putin managed to convince Yanukovych not to sign the enslaving agreement, and the intransigence of the Europeans was precisely explained by their lack of faith that Russia would actually do this. The surprise of the partners gave way to hysteria and threats. Such unceremonious behavior of foreign diplomats in the world has not, perhaps, been observed since 1918, when the Bolshevik Rodek, member of the delegation at the Brest negotiations, distributed anti-war propaganda leaflets to German soldiers and officers right on the Brest platform. In 2013, Western diplomats threatened Ukraine with civil war, talked about the illegitimacy of President Yanukovych, pitched tents right on Euromaidan, fed demonstrators and went with them to unauthorized demonstrations, put pressure on Ukrainian oligarchs. The West tried to fully implement not even an orange revolution, but a diplomatic revolution. And almost openly. In response, Russia once again outplayed its partners. She moved forward again, making a move that the States and Europe did not expect. During Yanukovych's visit to Russia, agreements were signed, which I would like to dwell on in more detail. Why? Because they have already become the object of speculation and attempts to pass off victory as defeat. The price of gas for Ukraine was reduced quite significantly. Who lost in this? Gazprom. Yes, this company, 51% owned by the state, lost some of its revenue. But let's ask ourselves, what should be the purpose of operating a public company of this size? Make money for 49% of private investors. No. Follow Russia's interest. Money is secondary here and is only a means, not an end. What are Russia's interests? They are very simple: to prevent the transfer of control over the territory of Ukraine, economic, political, military, to the hands of the EU and NATO. For particularly stubborn liberals, I will repeat, the main thing is the flight time of the rockets. If they are placed near Kharkov, it will be too late to shoot them down. Question: how much can the price of gas be reduced so that the security of our country does not decrease? Answer: such concepts are not measured by money. If money were the main thing, then the United States, with its national debt and budget deficit, would never have allocated billions of dollars to human rights defenders around the world. But they do. Because it helps them maintain and increase influence in strategically important regions, maintain a monopoly on the dollar and ultimately receive much more than they spend. So measuring geopolitics with money is utter stupidity. But even here the liberals are blatantly lying, shedding crocodile tears about wasted money and not reporting what Russia has acquired. And this is what we have acquired: the shipbuilding factories of Ukraine receive our orders, the military industry of Ukraine begins to work for our army. For reference, after the destruction of the USSR, about 500 military enterprises remained on the territory of Ukraine, but for 20 years of independence, in fact, fragmentation, the Ukrainian army did not receive any new weapons, with the exception of several dozen tanks. And one more thing, from the sphere of finance. The ruble is becoming a first-class currency in Ukraine, like the dollar and the euro. MBU is the National Bank of Ukraine, that is, the central bank. The MBU will make the ruble freely convertible. 1. The MBU includes the ruble in the first group of the classifier of foreign currencies, which will allow our bank to increase its gold and foreign exchange reserves. This will happen thanks to a swap with the Central Bank of Russia. A couple of years ago, Ukrainians promised Russians to pay for gas in Russian rubles. But then it was not profitable for NSE. Until now, Group 1 included 11 currencies that were widely used for payment in foreign trade transactions. The appearance of the Russian currency in the group of freely convertible currencies should simplify the infusion of Russian capital investments into Ukraine. Russia will buy Ukrainian government bonds worth $15 billion. Liberals were especially indignant about this point. This is how many kindergartens could be built. It's funny that the situation when all the gold and foreign exchange reserves of the Central Bank of Russia, GR, were invested in debt securities of the United States and its allies did not bother the liberals. And this situation has always been. This is a form of payment of tribute by Russia in favor of the West. No one will ever pay us back these debts. In addition, funds from the reserve fund are also placed in debt securities of Western countries. Something I have never heard of liberals considering this abnormal. In addition, the funds of the National Welfare Fund are placed in the same debt securities, government bonds of developed democracies. Have you ever read angry articles by liberals saying that this is wrong and criminal? Meanwhile, the funds of the National Welfare Fund are placed in debt obligations of the same Western states. Funds of the National Welfare Fund can be placed in debt obligations in the form of securities of foreign states, foreign government agencies and central banks of the following countries: Austria, Belgium, Great Britain, Germany, Denmark, Spain, Canada, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, USA, Finland, France, Sweden. As you can see, Ukraine is not on this list. To buy Ukrainian bonds, you will have to issue special government orders, changing the law. So the thing is that Putin takes money to buy Ukrainian bonds from the money with which Russia should buy US and European bonds. In fact, we are buying Ukrainian debts instead of American debts. At the expense of our Western partners, we are buying the politics of Ukraine. But that's not all. Putin would not be Putin if he had not foreseen several important things. 1. The cost of gas for Ukraine is determined by the agreement to the contract. The contractual high price does not change, and the additional agreement is valid only for 3 months. If Ukraine's policy changes, the previous price may return. Now the Ukrainian leadership will fly to Moscow every 3 months to report then conclude a new additional agreement. 2. 15 billion on Ukrainian debt securities are also spent not at once, but gradually. If Ukraine's policy changes, Russia may not buy debt securities. So far we are only buying for 3 billion. 3. An agreement with Russia makes Yanukovych more stable. If the president of Ukraine changes, an orange coup d'etat will occur, Russia may increase the price of gas and not buy Ukraine's national debt. By adding need to Yanukovych in the eyes of Ukrainian business, Russia makes him more dependent on itself. Only by relying on us can he stay in power and be re-elected for a new term. 4. The main supporters of European integration were the Ukrainian oligarchs. For their production, the low price of gas is a significant argument. After all, the West offers nothing. And the last thing I want to say. Economic agreements concluded with Ukraine also carry with them a political component. And this is normal. When investing money, Russia must protect its investments. Therefore, we do not want to see a Ukraine where decisions will be made in Brussels and on which we will not be able to influence in any way. People from the IMF have always behaved in exactly the same way towards Russia. After all, liberals have always told us that politically motivated IMF loans for our country are right and good. The leaders of this organization must protect their investments. So Russia protects. And he changes his policy to a more active and offensive one. What is Viktor Yanukovych bargaining with the opposition about? January 21, 2014. The end of last week brought a lot of news from the capital of Ukraine. First, the Party of Regions in the Rada unexpectedly adopted a whole package of laws, despite all attempts to block the work of parliament by the opposition. Then the Maidan leaders responded by calling a rally, which, even according to their estimates, had not 1 million or 500,000, but only 80,000 participants. That is, in any case, there are an order of magnitude fewer active Protestants. After a rally at which there were calls for the creation of a parallel parliament, which is an attempt to usurp power and oppose the most serious articles of the criminal code, groups of militants suddenly decided to break through to the government building. On Sunday evening, when no one is there, the police blocked the path of armed militant groups and steadfastly endured all the bullying of the latter. Strikes, throwing incendiary shells, setting buses on fire. In response, the police and soldiers of the internal troops only defended themselves and only used one water cannon late in the evening, either to extinguish passions or to extinguish fires. What is happening, and why do Ukrainian law enforcement agencies not receive orders to disperse and arrest militants? Because now there is a bargaining going on in Ukraine. And there is nothing new in this, bargaining, negotiations, whatever you want to call it. Politics is generally divided into 2 parts. The first is actions, the second is bargaining and negotiations. Actions are completed, bargaining begins. The Ukrainian government is bargaining with the Ukrainian opposition. Both sides made their moves. The authorities have adopted, but have not yet published laws, the effect of which will begin from the moment of publication. The opposition wants to prevent this publication. Why? Because according to these laws, the entire opposition can be sent to the bank. The conversation goes something like this. You are driving us into a corner, say the opposition leaders. If you publish laws, you can put us all in prison. If we continue to protest against them. And if we don't protest, we lose all authority in the eyes of our activists and voters, like cowards afraid of new laws. So let's do this, you don't publish them, and we are slowly curtailing the Maidan, passing it off as our victory. Against the backdrop of the start of such negotiations, conflicting news appeared on the news feed. Either the government refuses to publish laws, or it plans to publish them. Immediately, riots begin, during which it turns out that the Maidan leaders have no control over this raging Maidan. A vivid symbol of this is Klitschko, who was doused with a fire extinguisher, which made him look like anyone, but not a revolutionary. And here we need to answer the question, why does the Ukrainian government not give permission for the dispersal? The answer is multi-layered. 5. The government, which is under pressure from the states, must demonstrate a desire to come to an agreement with the opposition. 6. In this situation, exposing the security forces to the attack of militants is for the Ukrainian authorities to gain trump cards in negotiations. Alas, this is true. Here, gentlemen, Americans, as you said, we negotiate, we bargain, we do not publish laws. But on the other hand, there are those who don't keep their words. How to deal with them? Our boycott stands rooted to the spot, we control it. What do the Maidan leaders control? You can see for yourself that it's nothing. They don't even control fire extinguishers. At all times, under all rulers, the mistakes of politicians were corrected with the blood of soldiers and officers. And today, the courageous guys from Bakhmut, military conscripts, and other security forces of Ukraine are paying for the erroneous policy of the last 4 years of European integration. As for pogromists and militants, then, according to Chekhov, the gun hanging on the stage in the first act must definitely fire in the second. And the Maidan leaders cannot prevent this shot. The crowd, driven by hatred, behaves unpredictably and rushes on Sunday evening to places where there is no point in rushing at this time. Monday comes, but the bargaining continues. On Monday, the Ukrainian TVI channel ran a line that a Bakhmut sniper was shooting at Maidan activists. Other media said they see snipers on rooftops. Are there snipers from the secret services there? There definitely must be. But not for shooting at demonstrators, but to prevent provocations, the general name of which is unknown snipers. Shooting opens, the victims are then attributed to the bloody regime, and passions and hysteria escalate. We have seen unknown snipers more than once in Syria, Libya, Yemen, Egypt, recently. A little earlier in Kyrgyzstan and Thailand, even earlier in 1993 in Moscow, in 1990 in Vilnius. The appearance of running lines about snipers is a hint from the authorities. We'll kill people and blame you. By the way, another reason for the inaction of the police is precisely this: they will begin to smash the militants. In the chaos, the opposition will quickly organize several corpses. Since the bloody regime doesn't do it on its own, we need to help it. Every revolution must have heroes. And preferably dead. Since the negotiations are being held behind closed doors, we can only guess what is being said. And in the same way we can imagine several possible scenarios for the development of events. So, once again, the proposed negotiations have several goals. The goal of the so-called opposition, or rather, the West behind them. The attack on Ukraine, the blitzkrieg of the European Union, failed. Knowing Putin's Russia, Western strategists cannot help but understand that Putin will never allow a Libyan or even Egyptian soft scenario in Ukraine under any circumstances. Under these conditions, a forceful seizure of power, which was possible even before the Russian-Ukrainian agreement on gas, is no longer possible. Its initiation will lead to the fact that the Russian army, having secured a UN mandate and having the status of peacekeeping forces, will enter Ukraine, as it once did into Ossetia, and then they will not see Ukraine as their ears. Based on this, the West decided to temporarily retreat and launch a new offensive a little later. The most important element of this retreat is the organized collapse of the Maidan. Organization is a mandatory condition, as it allows one to maintain the legitimacy of opposition leaders in the eyes of Maidan activists, which, for the most part, are simply propagandized citizens, organized by provocateurs against the backdrop of the strongest propaganda through Western-controlled media. This means that we need a reason that can be declared a victory of the Maidan, and against the backdrop of this victory, we can say, it's time to go home. Such a production will not cause rejection among the Maidan infantry, and will not leave them with the feeling that they were deceived in their expectations. Moreover, it should be noted that the rejection of the laws adopted on January 16 may just be that very victory, since the revision of gas agreements is no longer feasible. Another prospect for an organized retreat is a stampede. The West is already ready to stop supporting and financing the Maidan leaders, and after them all Maidan activists, due to the fact that further actions of professional losers, which are the Maidan leaders, are an escalation of tension with Russia and personally with Putin. This escalation in the current situation does not give tangible and quick dividends, but calls into question many issues in which Europe already depends on Russia. The goal of the Ukrainian government. It also consists of calming the Maidan, but at the same time calming it down without using force. Why? Because the Ukrainian government is not ready to turn into an outcast and stop playing on the contradictions between Russia and the EU. Accordingly, the government is ready to abandon new laws and not publish them. But she needs to bargain with the Maidan for what she needs, the winding down of the protest without blood and noise. This is the only thing that will allow the Ukrainian government to preserve its trademark multi-vector approach and calmly use the $15 billion received from Russia, plus a discount on Russian gas. Against the backdrop of this situation and the background of the proposed negotiations, the following scenarios are possible. 7. We agreed amicably. This means that the laws will not come into force, since they will not be published. And the Maidan, having recorded on paper or verbally, but publicly, such a decision of the authorities, will loudly declare its victory. After which it will begin to gradually dissolve, freeing the streets and squares from protesters. The winding down process will take 3 to 6 months. 8. The authorities will demand that the opposition prove its ability to manage the Maidan and begin to collapse the Maidan even before the announcement of the abandonment of the laws or simultaneously with such an announcement. There may be difficulties here, since Maidan is poorly managed. In Ukraine, the situation may repeat itself, as in Russia after 1905, when the need for revolutionaries had already disappeared from the geopolitical partners, and the ordinary revolutionaries themselves forgot to tell about it. This policy was expressed in the fact that later the partners themselves helped the Tsarist secret services catch ships with weapons and turn a blind eye to the court-martial. Foreign intelligence services have cut off their generous funding of revolutionaries, reducing development budgets to existence budgets. In this case, Yanukovych has the opportunity to completely crush the opposition. First, loudly declaring agreements with the protest leaders, which would be a break in all patterns for ordinary Maidan activists, and then declaring opponents as people who do not keep their word. As a result, there are actually quiet repressions against the leaders of the Maidan, and it will no longer matter whether the laws are published or not. 9. Yanukovych is under the illusion that it is possible to reach an agreement with the puppet masters of the Maidan, with Western countries. This will mean permanent Maidan and the no peace, no war policy for about another 6 months. After which, either a sharp turn towards the EU, with the West guaranteeing his victory in the presidential elections, or a sharp turn towards Russia and an attempt to ensure his own victory by playing the Russian card. 10. We didn't agree on anything at all, since the Maidan leaders do not understand the gravity of their own situation and put forward unacceptable conditions, thinking that they are the masters of the situation. This leads to the publication of laws and the beginning of their implementation in practice. Europe is becoming hysterical and putting forward stupid initiatives. Ukraine is moving towards Russia, since only Russia alone can ensure the continuity of power and the legalization of the capital of the so-called elite. One of these 4 options, or the 5th, some combination of them in some proportion, has the following consequences for the 3 players: Russia, Ukraine, West equals EC plus USA. 1. Russia, the consequences are either positive to varying degrees, or 0, combat draw. 2. Ukraine, options can be both positive and negative. For the people of Ukraine and for representatives of the Maidan and the power elite. The spread is large, from the most negative to the most positive. 3. But the third player, the West, does not have any good options. The greatest success of Western diplomacy may be that Russia may have the worst option. 0. Combat draw with saving face. Summarize. We can state that the trend continues. It can be expressed by the Russian proverb, the claw gets stuck, the whole bird is lost. And we are talking about the Western bird. She got stuck in Syria, and is now plunged up to her neck into Ukrainian chaos. She threw away all and every mask. Supports peaceful demonstrators, when even the blind can see the peacefulness of their intentions. He demands that the authorities remove special forces from the city in order to deprive the authorities of their trump cards in negotiations. A desperate attempt to tie things up on the part of the West. Moreover, without much sense, without benefit and without victory. Gagauzia won Chisinau. February 4, 2014. If Moldova loses its independence, the Gagauz autonomy will be ready to determine its own destiny. This was clearly demonstrated by the results of the referendum that took place in Gagauzia last weekend. In a nutshell, the meaning of everything that is happening is as follows. European integrators of Moldova are ready to sacrifice its independence and surrender its territory to Romania. However, under no circumstances are the two parts of Moldova going to become Romanians. These are Transnistria and Gagauzia. And they can be understood, you live and live, consider yourself Russian, Moldavian, Ukrainian or Gagauz. And officials from Chisinau come to you and tell you that you are Romanian. Results of the referendum in Gagauzia, 98.9%, for independence, 98.47%, for the customs union, 97.22%, against the EU. According to preliminary official data of the vote count at the referendum held on February 2 in Gagauzia, the overwhelming majority of residents of the autonomy voted for the delayed independence status of Gagauzia, for integration into the Russia-Belarus-Kazakhstan customs union and against integration into the EU. A Regnum correspondent was informed about this on February 3 at the press service of the People's Assembly of Gagauzia. According to the official data of the Central Electoral Commission of Gagauzia cited in the NSG report, at the legislative referendum, 98.9% of those who took part in the plebiscite voted for the postponed status of independence, and 1.9% voted against it. At the consultative referendum, 98.47% of voters who came to the ballot boxes voted in favor of joining the customs union, and 1.52% voted against it. The course aimed at Moldova joining the European Union was supported by 2.77% of voters, while 97.22% were against it. The chairman of the Central Election Commission of Gagauzia, Valentina Lisnik, said that the Central Election Commission will continue its work, and after drawing up a report and protocol of vote counting, the final results of the referendum will be announced. 2. Summarize. If Moldova loses its independence, Gagauzia and Transnistria will declare their independence. This has been clearly demonstrated, and it does not matter at all whether Chisinau recognizes the results of the past plebiscite or not. They are visual, they are killer. 11. Attempts to make Moldova Romania will mean a serious aggravation of the situation, up to the possibility of bloodshed. 12. No sane politician would ever say in such a situation that Moldova should become Romania, so as not to risk the outbreak of war in their home country. 13. Moldova became part of the Russian Empire in 1812, and until the revolutionary unrest of 1917, no one ever disputed this. 14. Russia will become strong and powerful again, and the Romanian integrators will again melt away like smoke. Because, as the Bashkan of Gagauzia Formuza rightly noted, Romanians are a unique army. During one war, they managed to reach Moscow with the Germans, and Berlin with the Russians. Just recently I was on a visit to Chisinau and Gagauzia. Met with the public and deputies of the Gagauz parliament. I hope that I also made my modest contribution to the results of the last referendum. Moldova must remain Moldova, and its people must decide the fate of their country. Why is the dollar rising in price? February 17, 2014. I talked about the reasons for the depreciation of the national currencies of Russia and Kazakhstan in a short video for educational TV. A. Voitenkov, Nikolai Viktorovich, what is happening with the ruble exchange rate? If you look at us, the exchange rate of the dollar and euro first grew, then suddenly fell, then something else happens. The reason of that. What's behind this? And Starikov, I think that we can look at this situation more clearly by seeing what happened in Kazakhstan. Russia and Kazakhstan are oil-producing countries that export resources. It is clear that we do not want our economy to be dependent on oil. But today we will talk about something else. Both countries are oil-producing countries. Let's look at the price of oil. Early 2013, $110. Early 2014, $108. That is, the oil remained the same. At the same time, we see that national currencies in relation to the dollar and euro by approximately 15%, maybe a little more in Russia, smoothly decreased their exchange rate over the year, and in Kazakhstan the tenge devalued by 20% in one day. What happened? We see that the economic reasons that liberal economists always tell us about do not exist. What do they always tell us? The price of oil decreases, the dollar rises, the ruble falls. We see that the price of oil is not decreasing. Nevertheless, the dollar is growing, the euro is growing, and the ruble and tenge are declining. Moreover, the ruble fell smoothly all year, but the tenge fell sharply, the exchange rate was sharply reduced. There is no economics in this. What remains? What remains is politics. Let us now understand what political components there are in these events. To understand what is happening, we must remember that the central bank, in Russia, in Kazakhstan, is independent of the state. We can understand this using the example of what is happening now. The United States of America is experiencing serious difficulties. Mathematics got involved. If servicing a national debt of 2 trillion requires a small amount of interest, then 15 trillion requires a lot of interest. And the United States pays this interest in the same way by issuing new debt obligations. In fact, this amount is increased by percentage. Demand for dollars in the world is decreasing. Agree, it is already generally accepted that today's dollar is not the same as it was 10 years ago, it is weak, and you can buy less with it. This means that the dollar is less popular. This means that someone keeps money in rubles, tenge, euros, or some other currencies. If there are no dollars, then there are no purchases of US debt. Because in any case, in order to purchase American debt obligations, you first need to purchase dollars, at a minimum. To solve the problem, to increase the demand for its debt securities, the United States needs to increase the demand for the dollar. But the United States cannot radically improve its economy. Because we see that the debt is growing all the time, the economy is not starting. The United States cannot improve the situation in its economy, what can it do? What's the situation in those economies from which resources need to be pumped? If you collapse the ruble, tenge, Ukrainian hryvnia, Polish zloty, to a lesser extent, the currencies of other countries, such as Argentina, Brazil, then the resources of these currencies will flow into more reliable assets, the dollar and debt obligations. How does the United States do this? This is where we remember about independent central banks. This is especially clear in the example of Kazakhstan. Suddenly the tenge exchange rate drops by 20% in one day. Question: what happened? Yesterday there was another 155 tenge per dollar, and today, 185. What has changed? Has there been a catastrophic drop in oil prices? What? Nothing. And this is what happened. For quite a long period of time, from Russia, from Kazakhstan, from other countries, Americans begin to withdraw assets, sell shares, buy currency, and withdraw it from the country. The central bank tries to counteract this a little, but then realizes that it will be left without gold and foreign exchange reserves. And in fact, at one fine moment this situation begins to release. In Russia, this situation was released little by little, so the currency was gradually declining all year. In Kazakhstan they did it abruptly. Essentially this is sabotage. Social panic as a reason, everyone is unhappy. You understand that you wouldn't do this normally. No sane leader of the country would allow his minister in charge of finance to collapse the exchange rate in one day without loss of image. We see that Kazakhstan is one of the most stable countries, and the leader of Kazakhstan is one of the most sensible leaders that we see not only in the post-Soviet space, but in principle. This means that the central bank acts without the sanction of the country's leadership. He simply, based on his instructions, his provisions, which are based on the principles of the IMF, begins to lower the national currency because otherwise he will be left without gold and foreign exchange reserves. And such a catastrophic fall occurs. If we go to a more understandable example, an everyday one, the central bank is a huge guy who shakes an apple or pear tree to shake the fruit and take it to his American friends. Kazakhstan became 20% poorer in one day. This means that Americans will receive 20% more from Kazakhstan. They will receive some percentage more from Russia. Look. What is happening in Russia? All our gold and foreign exchange reserves are in their securities. This is what belongs to the central bank. Our national wealth funds and reserve fund are also mainly in these securities. The so-called budget rule has been adopted, the essence of which is very simple, to increase the purchase of American debt by 10%. But this is no longer enough. They need to lower the exchange rates of other countries in order to skim more cream for themselves. This is the meaning of what is happening. Let's return to the independence of the central bank. People who see all this have a question: who will be responsible for this? The head of the National Bank of Kazakhstan should be dismissed. Right. Wrong, because if you look at the law on the central bank, both Russia and Kazakhstan, some American advisors wrote, you will see points according to which this leader can be dismissed. 1. The first point, his contract has expired. He didn't run out of it. 2. Second, he violated the laws of Kazakhstan. He didn't break them at all. He acted in accordance with the law on the Central Bank of Kazakhstan and his internal instructions. Didn't break anything. 3. A criminal case has been initiated against him. There is a criminal court verdict. He has not committed any criminal offense. 4. Due to health reasons, you can send. Healthy as a bull. 5. And lastly, he himself wrote a statement, a resignation letter. No. Here are 5 reasons why the head of the central bank of both Kazakhstan and Russia can be dismissed. If all this is not there, it will collapse the national currency rate by at least 50%, you cannot do anything with it. This is the paradox, this is independence. He is appointed in agreement with the Americans, there is an appointment procedure. But there is no recall procedure. This is the huge problem. Why did this happen in Kazakhstan? Everything collapsed at once, while in Russia the exchange rate gradually dropped. Because in Kazakhstan, apparently, Nazarbayev failed to exert certain influence and pressure on the Central Bank of Kazakhstan. And in Russia, Vladimir Vladimirovich called Elvira Nabiullina and had a heart-to-heart talk with her, and therefore this process happened quite smoothly, but at the same time firmly. What conclusions emerge from this? The central bank needs to be subordinated to the state. In today's situation, there are no levels of influence on the central bank other than intimate conversations. If you fire this manager, he will, in accordance with both state and international law, immediately file for arbitration and be reinstated in this post. Because he did everything as he should have done. Because the entire system is aimed at siphoning resources in favor of the United States and its European allies. That's the main problem. And there may be indirect things from this. Imagine, the president of Kazakhstan begins to say that the central bank is not working well. Today we see, he, as a sensible politician, says what? Well, it's good that the exchange rate has dropped by 20%. But national producers of Kazakhstan will receive preferences. Will they get it? Of course, due to the depreciation of the currency. But we must understand that the leader, politician, says this because if he says other things, it will be even worse. A. Voitenkov, correct? He cannot say, They are so and so bad, they don't listen to me, they ruined our cause. N. Starikov, okay. Let's say a softer wording, the Central Bank of Kazakhstan, its head, failed to cope with the functions of a regulator and controller. For everything to happen the way it should happen, I couldn't cope. What follows from this? International agencies, all sorts of Moody's, Standard & Poor's and other features, what do? They are lowering the credit rating of Kazakhstan because its central bank is not working well, its country's leader is interfering with the competence of an independent central bank. This is the most important thing. And Kazakhstan is getting additional problems in the financial market because its securities are no longer quoted. As soon as you start to initiate this scandal, the state gets worse. This is how cleverly this system works. What should we strive for? Towards the creation of a national emission center. Perhaps supranational, to solve the problems of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan at once. An emission center within the framework of the new Eurasian Union, in which our currency will be, perhaps smoothly, perhaps less smoothly, untied from the dollar, and we will receive the function of supranational sovereign emission. This is what it should be. And the central bank is the one that will carry out this issue. It will be directly subordinate to the country's leadership. And then such pandemonium will never happen. As long as we are included in this system, we must understand that any crisis is organized in order to help Americans solve their problems. I say something that may not be very obvious at the moment. The weakening of the tenge and ruble exchange rate is caused by colossal problems with the dollar and the American economy. This is where the paradox really lies. A. Voitenkov, so we should expect the currencies of other countries to weaken. N. Starikov, it is happening little by little. For example, the Polish zloty also fell. But Poland is included in the European Union. If you start losing zlotys, the whole democracy leads to a high standard of living system will collapse. This is the first. Second, the Polish economy is small. You won't shake anything from a Polish tree, one pear will fall to you. But from the Russian market, from the Kazakh market, you can shake up a whole basket of apples and pears and take them to your American partners so that they can quickly eat them. That's the problem. A. Voitenkov, they will shake us, from Kazakhstan, and then they will go to shake someone else. Not the European Union, but India, China, and someone else. And Starikov, yes. But we need to understand that they will shake us again when they feel bad again. For some reason, any of their crises affects us. A very clever system. When the US economy is booming, it siphons resources out of us because that's where everything goes. When the US economy is bad, it still pulls the same resources out of us. Being in this connection, in this global financial economy, we will never be able to live normally. Because we are always extreme. We are always those slaves whose forelocks crack when the lords resolve their issues. Therefore, we need to gradually leave this system, returning to sovereign emissions. 3. Protests organized by Washington are destabilizing the situation in Ukraine. February 16, 2014. American politician Paul Craig Roberts analyzes the situation in Ukraine. 4. And he has absolutely no doubt that the protests in our neighbors are organized by the CIA, the US State Department, as well as non-governmental organizations, NGOs, funded by Washington and the EU. However, his view from across the ocean does not see the details. After all, there was never any talk of Ukraine's direct entry into the EC. But in general, it is very useful to get acquainted with the thoughts of someone who worked under Reagan in the US administration, and today is a critic of modern US policy. The American politician makes the reason for what is happening in Ukraine crystal clear. The protests in western Ukraine are organized by the CIA, the US State Department, as well as Washington and EU-funded non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, that work together with the CIA and the State Department. The purpose of the protest is to reverse the decision of the independent government of Ukraine not to join the EU. It's difficult to agree with Paul Craig Roberts on details. He points out that, for the EU government the goal is to enlarge the EU. Not so, no one was going to accept Ukraine into the EC. The goal is different, Ukrainian territory as a colony. Is there a difference? She is huge. A colony is never equal to the metropolis. Its task is to pump resources to the metropolis. As for the details of the US goals, the author writes about it this way: Washington's goals are to provide Ukraine for robbery by American banks and corporations and to bring Ukraine into NATO, so that Washington can place more military bases on the border with Russia. The desire to bring NATO infrastructure closer to Russia is certainly visible in what has happened and is happening near the borders of the Russian Federation. From the border with Ukraine it is only 500 kilometers to Moscow. For a rocket, a minute of summer. Flight time is a very important characteristic. But in destroying Ukraine, the Americans are pursuing many goals. More precisely, these are all goals of the second level, these are means. The main goal is to weaken Russia as one of the United States competitors. Paul Roberts fully agrees with this. There are three countries in the world that stand in the way of Washington's hegemony throughout the world: Russia, China, and Iran. Each of these countries is being targeted by Washington for their destruction or degradation of their sovereignty through propaganda, and is also targeted by American military bases that are stationed in countries forced to host them by Washington's will. Paul Roberts' article came out at a time when the famous Matt of State Department Representative Victoria Nuland, as a result of the leak of her conversation, was heard throughout the world. And it became obvious to everyone that the states themselves decide who should be the Prime Minister of Ukraine, and in this process they do not even listen to the opinion of Europe. The reaction of neoconservative Victoria Nuland, appointed Assistant Secretary of State by the duplicitous Obama, was, "Fuck the EU." In a telephone conversation, she described in detail the members of the Ukrainian government that Washington intended to impose on the people of Ukraine, so unaware that they, believing in independence, were in a hurry to rush into Washington's arms. I once thought that there was no population more naive than the population of the United States. But I was wrong. Western Ukrainians are even more naive than Americans, writes the American politician. 5. He mentions that Victoria Nuland herself has already said that the United States invested $5 billion in supporting democracy in Ukraine. 6. I have never in my life witnessed people as senseless as Ukrainian protesters who are destroying the independence of their country, writes an American politician who does not like the double standards used by the United States in its foreign policy. Even though the Ukrainian protesters were violent, the police were restrained. Washington has a vested interest in continuing the protests, in hopes of turning these protests into an insurrection so Washington can take over Ukraine. This week, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution threatening sanctions if violent protests are cracked down by police. In other words, if Ukrainian police behave towards violent protesters in the same way that American police behave towards peaceful demonstrators, this will become a reason for Washington to interfere in the internal affairs of Ukraine. Washington is using the protests to destroy Ukraine's independence and already has a ready list of puppets that Washington intends to install as the next government of Ukraine. 7. How the fifth column is fighting the customs union. February 19, 2014. The customs union is the first step towards the restoration of the common geopolitical space. Restoration of a powerful union of Slavs, Turks and other peoples, united within the framework of Russian civilization. The USA understands this. They understand and resist. Today's attempt to tear Ukraine away from Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, etc., at any cost is nothing more than creating obstacles to the reintegration of the economies and political systems of what was a single whole for hundreds of years and only thanks to Gorbachev's betrayal became different states. Propaganda of the negative consequences, worthlessness, uselessness of the customs union is going on in all countries. Ukraine. Here the customs union is called in leaflets Tiger. Creating a terrible impression that after joining the CU everyone will immediately be sent to Fellwood in the Tiger. Russia. More than 2 months have passed since the creation of the customs union. The Russian newspaper Vedomosti, citing anonymous sources, writes about Russia's losses from the customs union. The Russian budget in the first half of 2011 could have received a shortfall of about 18.5 billion rubles due to the fact that import duties within the customs union are distributed among Russian budgets, Belarus and Kazakhstan according to a predetermined formula, and not based on real import data. 8. Kazakhstan. The Kazakh opposition is initiating a referendum on the issue of Kazakhstan's withdrawal from the customs union with Russia and Belarus. Oppositionists believe that the customs union is more like an attempt to restore the USSR than a profitable economic project. Belarus. Belarus must leave the customs union and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. This statement is contained in the Manifesto on the Protection of National Interest, voiced on August 23 by the leader of the Belarusian Popular Front Party, Alexei Yanukovych, and the party's presidential contender, Grigory Kostusev. In addition, members of the Belarusian Popular Front declared the need to withdraw Russian military bases from the territory of Belarus, since our land is not intended to be a shield, outpost, or buffer for neighboring states. 10. Joining the customs union has not yet brought tangible results to Belarus. On the contrary, according to experts, its virtually planned economy was unable to compete with the market economies of Russia and Kazakhstan. Now the country is going through a severe financial and economic crisis, which has been brought closer by joining the customs union. 11. Please note that, according to the experts, than the opposition, all countries bear losses simultaneously. Belarusians, Kazakhs and Russians are told that they are the ones who lose when someone else wins. But that doesn't happen. As soon as there was talk about Armenia and Kyrgyzstan joining the customs union, similar information appeared in the independent media of Armenia and Kyrgyzstan. Armenia. A protest rally was held in front of the residence of the president of Armenia, the participants of which stated that they were against the statement signed yesterday in Moscow by President Serge Sargsyan on his readiness to join the customs union. The participants of the action came with USSR ice cream, thereby, in essence, showing that Armenia is taking a step towards restoring the former USSR. 12. In Armenia, civil initiative is protesting against joining the unified customs union. The initiative We Are Against the Customs Union with Russia issued a statement against Armenia's accession to this structure. As noted in the statement, if it joins the customs union, Armenia will not be able to conclude a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU and introduce European criteria throughout the economy. Let's leave aside the fact that the benefits to Armenia from the deep and comprehensive free trade area are incompatible with the customs union. Let us also leave aside the fact that we will suffer serious economic losses, as is the case with the rise in prices of granulated sugar, meat and building materials, since we import them mainly from countries outside the single customs union. The customs union is guided by authoritarianism and widespread corruption. This is an attempt to expand the borders of Russia, which is shining for its lack of freedom of speech. The Armenian people are part of European, not Russian civilization. We have a system of democratic values and will not tolerate the yoke of others, because freedom and independence are part of our self-awareness. We are concerned that if Armenia joins the unified customs union, it will actually lose its sovereignty, which after some time will be registered legally. Armenia will be erased from the political map of the world. 13. Wherever the fifth column speaks, it always says the same mantras about freedom, universal human values and scares its citizens with the destruction of Ukraine, Armenia, Belarus, if it joins the customs union. At the same time, it does not explain at all why, over the centuries of living together in the Russian Empire and the USSR, neither Armenians, nor Ukrainians, nor any people in general, disappeared or transferred. The favorite phrase of the fifth column is also the words that Ukrainians, Armenians, Belarusians are part of European civilization. It's quite funny that, following these patterns, the opposition from Kyrgyzstan says exactly the same things. And even more. Kyrgyzstan. You cannot compare Kyrgyzstan with such rich states within the customs union as Kazakhstan and Belarus. These two states, compared to Kyrgyzstan, have many economic features associated with Russia. They have enough powerful enterprises, plants, factories that can compete on equal terms with Russia. The second feature, the above countries, led by Russia, are totalitarian states. Today Belarus remains the only authoritarian state in Europe. It stands like an indelible black stain in Europe. Belarus is the only authoritarian state in Europe, and Kyrgyzstan is the only democratic state in Central Asia. There are many negative impacts on Kyrgyzstan from the customs union. Firstly, it is known that prices for food products will increase significantly to equalize them under the auspices of the customs union. It's clear that Chinese consumer goods will become more expensive. 14. It would seem like a set of ordinary horror stories. Russia is bad, everything will become more expensive, etc. But further, the KGB's conscientious journalist Nazako Zushbev surpasses all his liberal colleagues. Nevertheless, it would be good for Kyrgyzstan, which is inclined towards democratic values, to look further, strive for cooperation with the European Union, and become its member. Surely it is not without reason that China has recently been striving to become a member of this authoritative organization in the world. It would be much easier for Kyrgyzstan as a member of the World Trade Organization to create trade and economic relations with the European Union. The KGB's journalist clearly deserves an increase in his American grant. He lies blatantly, without blushing and falsifying facts on the fly, as befits a true fighter against totalitarianism. In 3 sentences he managed. Talk about the possibility of Kyrgyzstan joining the European Union. It will be clear to anyone other than a liberal that this is impossible for a number of reasons. If only for the fact that Kyrgyzstan is located in Asia. Present this entry, which is impossible in reality, as some kind of alternative to joining the customs union. It's strange that Nazako Zushbev does not write about the possibility of becoming the 51st state of the United States. For Kyrgyzstan, the probability is exactly the same as joining the EC. Write about China's desire to become a member of the European Union. Where did he get this from? I'm afraid that the KGB's oppositionist is the only keeper of such exclusive information in the world. Even the leaders of the CCP do not know about this. Point out that some mythical entry into the EC can help boost the economy and establish ties with the EC. I would like to ask, what is preventing WTO member Kyrgyzstan from establishing trade relations with the EC today? The conclusion suggests itself is the following: we need to move forward without listening to paid American propagandists who live in different countries and receive money for slowing down the unification of peoples into a single geopolitical space. Chapter 2. Coup d'etat in Ukraine, made in the USA. Ukraine, chronology of the defeat of the opposition. January 27, 2014. In the stream of alarming news coming from Ukraine, it is very difficult to discern the direction in which the wind is blowing. Assess a lot of facts, draw conclusions, and understand the direction of further events. Due to the fact that I perfectly understand and share the feeling of anxiety for the fate of the motherland and children that has gripped the residents of Ukraine, and seeing some misunderstanding of what is happening on the part of the patriots defending law and order, I will try to express my point of view. Moreover, apparently, ordinary Maidan activists themselves cannot soberly assess what is happening. The only ones among the opposition who understand the situation quite adequately are the trio Yatsenyuk, Klitschko, Tyagnerbok. That's why they walk around so gloomy. 11. Let's ask ourselves, where, in fact, did it all begin? Since Yanukovych's failure to sign the Enslaving Association Agreement with the EC. What demands did the Maidan movement put forward at the beginning? Bring back the dream. That is, sign an agreement. The pressure on Yanukovych began precisely from this. Before the non-signing, not a single oppositionist said that the president was illegitimate. And as soon as Yanukovych refused to sign, he immediately found himself in the center of a whole whirlwind of criticism and accusations. 12. Today no one remembers about this association agreement at all. This means that the goal has been achieved. Ukraine did not sign an enslaving agreement and was not handed over to the West for food. 13. All further steps of the opposition, led from the American embassy, on the one hand, and the Ukrainian leadership, on the other, are a delicate chess game. Terrible, like all political parties, where the pawns are ordinary citizens, their lives and health. 14. Yanukovych did not give in at all, did not give up at all. Like a chess game, he gave his opponent the initiative, sacrificed, and then drove the opponents into a corner. At first, Yanukovych did not disperse the militants, but gave them the opportunity to show their true nature when attempting to storm the presidential administration. This is when conscript soldiers were beaten, burned, and stoned by peaceful demonstrators. Then the authorities demonstratively harshly adopted a package of laws, according to which the leaders of the protest were given real deadlines, and thus put them in a very difficult position. The fact is that the Orange Revolution has its own special dramaturgy. The protest really should be peaceful, thus creating the illusion of popular support for the coup. Fighting in the street spoils the entire Orange drama, which only implies violence hidden behind peaceful protest, seizures and blocking of buildings. The essence of Orangism can be expressed in two words like this: we are peaceful, and the bloody regime is killing, beating us. When protesters beat and burn police under the barrel of television cameras, the effect is the opposite. The difficulty of the trio of oppositionists was that after the adoption of repressive laws, they could not help but react to them. You can't leave, they will become weaklings and lose all their supporters. Staying means leaving the right field and becoming rebels. Losing the halo of fighters and gaining the halo of criminals. Here there was an attempt by several hundred militants to break through to the Roda building through Grushevsky Street. The road was blocked by a boycott. The attack began. Again the whole world saw that the police were confronting armed and trained militants, and not peaceful demonstrators. This effect was paid for with the injuries of 200 law enforcement officers. There is apparently really no other way to win the information war in the current conditions of Ukraine, when all the channels are opposition. Please note, the attack on the Roda began on Sunday evening, when there was no one there except a few cleaners. And it was repeated without success, head-on, several times. No one even tried to enter the Roda from the other side. Only assault, only head-on. This means that the goal was not victory, but participation. It was important to demonstrate their trump cards, the militants in action, and not at all to break into an empty building. In this tense situation, the leadership of Ukraine did the right thing. Again, law enforcement officers were passive and allowed the militants to show themselves. Having encountered no resistance, they simply went crazy and almost got out of control. But boycott did not get out of control. What has become the new trump card of power: we control our forces, and you control yours. Then the opposition went to bargain with Yanukovych, realizing the sad truth of their situation. The goal of the trio is to collapse Maidan, which has ceased to be orange, and therefore has ceased to be needed by the West. Western curators began to curtail support for their charges. Remember how many diplomats and cookies there were on Maidan when the protest was peaceful. They all disappeared after the real fighting began. The task of Klitschko-Yatsenyuk was simple: to get some kind of concession that can be passed off as a victory and proudly live with it, curtailing the Maidan. It was not possible to reach an agreement. The laws were published and came into force. Now the move was up to the opposition. And it was done. The corpses of the demonstrators appeared. However, all attempts to pass them off as victims of the boycott snipers failed. It is significant that Western newspapers did not raise a howl about the bloody regime. The authorities' response was to disavow the version of the murder of demonstrators with a new round of police inaction. Well, how can you blame her if the boycott stands rooted to the spot? Unless about 10 people take it away and again stand in the same place. Don't forget, time works for power. A crowd driven by emotions is a terrible force. But she has one weakness: she is not able to be wound up for a long time. The next trump card of the opposition was the seizure of government buildings in the regions. The hope of getting a picture of a popular uprising for Western friends is again failing. The comments of the newspapers, they are caustic: disappointment in Klitschko, in the anti-Semite Tayagnobok, in the indecisive Yatsenyuk. They don't like taking over buildings either. Ukraine is still in first place in the news and on the front pages, but the time allocated to it is shrinking. In Sunday German newspapers, Ukraine is already on the second page. The Maidan leaders know that they are already deprived of the support of the West, that he will still grumble for formalities, but for himself he has already closed the Maidan 2014 project. To open the elections 2015 project. A colossal gift for the trio could be a forceful dispersal. Then they dismantle the Maidan for a good reason, become martyrs, and have every chance to lead the Maidan 2015. But Yanukovych understands this and does not give them what they want. Here the president of Ukraine makes a brilliant knight's move. He proposes Yatsenyuk to become prime minister, and Klitschko to become deputy prime minister for social issues. The oppositionists are knocked out. The move is the strongest. Agreeing for Yatsenyuk and Klitschko means to assign responsibility to themselves, and they would like to give it to Yanukovych, so that by the time of the new elections he will be to blame for everything. Yanukovych can fire them at any time in disgrace. Social issues are generally a bad place, like agriculture during the USSR. Success is impossible and failure is guaranteed. For the two of them to agree would mean to quarrel with the third, Tyagnobok. He is not offered any position. But the bulk of the militants are his. And then what will Prime Minister Yatsenyuk do? Disperse the Svoboda militants who do not want to disperse. It's also impossible to refuse the president's offer. You look like a frivolous clown. Can you scream? Can't you walk? That is why the answer of the oppositionist is taken from Trotsky's biography. We do not agree, but we do not refuse either. Why is that? There's just nothing to say. Knockout. Now what? Now the bargaining will continue. The opposition will try to cancel the laws adopted under them and, declaring this a huge victory, collapse the Maidan. Other Yanukovych's concessions similarly give them nothing but a pretext. Let's summarize. Through precise and competent steps, the Ukrainian authorities have driven the opposition into such a situation that any of its actions only worsens its position. The coup failed and cannot succeed. This is what the leaders do not tell the ordinary Maidan activist. Now the bargaining is not for the victory of the opposition, but for an acceptable form of their defeat. The West understands perfectly well that a forceful seizure of power in several regions or in Kiev will lead to a split in the country and a potential war, which it does not need. With the collapse of Ukraine, the West will receive Westerners and zero industry, and Russia will receive zero Westerners and all Ukrainian industry. Russia also does not need the collapse of Ukraine, since a war near our borders, in the place where our fleet is based, where our brothers and sisters live, could be a colossal problem for us. This means that Western support for the oppositionists is decreasing every day, and support, with advice and credit, for Yanukovych from Russia will not decrease. That's it. All that remains is to once again express my great respect to the guys from Bakhmut. It is their endurance, courage and professionalism that have become the main resource of the current chess game. I would like to note that today's events are an echo of the collapse of the United Country in 1991. The policy of creating national elites, separate, upponage principalities, fragmentation, beautifully called independence, all became a consequence of the betrayal of their people by Gorbachev and his accomplices. And the holes that arise, as usual, are plugged with the bodies of soldiers and officers. The Bakhmut soldier or soldier of the internal troops, wounded today in Kiev, is a victim of the civil war, the civil strife that was imposed on our people in 1991. Like the soldiers of the Russian army who died in Skemvali in 2008, like numerous victims of many interethnic conflicts in the space of a once united country. I would like to hope that these sacrifices will not be in vain. There is an attempted coup in Kiev. February 19, 2014. In 2004, the Orange Revolution took place in Ukraine in its purest, classic version. 10 years later, in the same place, on the Maidan, we see the final collapse of the seizure of power through the Orange scenario. Having been defeated in the delicate chess game for control of Ukraine, the West decided to mix up the pieces and hit it over the head with the board. The Orange rules of power grabs have been thrown aside. Girls with carnations in their hands and peaceful demonstrators are becoming a thing of the past. They are being replaced by the good old coup d'etat with all the corresponding attributes: trained militants, shot-dead law enforcement officers, seizures of government buildings, arson, robberies, murders. Today's events in Kiev clearly demonstrate the frank transition of the Western-funded opposition to the use of force to seize power. Why did this happen? President Putin said this some time ago. In my opinion, everything that is happening, as I have already said, is not directly related to Ukraine's interaction with the European Union. This is an internal political process, an attempt by the opposition to shake up the current, legitimate, I want to emphasize, government in the country. And moreover, everything that is happening now suggests that this is not a revolution at all, but well-prepared actions. And these actions, in my opinion, were not prepared for today. They were preparing for the presidential election campaign in the spring of 2015. It's just a slight false start due to certain circumstances, but these are all preparations for the presidential elections. The West had to build a new arrangement of figures on the fly, improvising. As a result, we saw a strange trio of the Nazi Tayagnabok, the boxer Klitschko and the liberal Yatsenyuk, who were unable to achieve anything and in 2.5 months completely lost their authority even among their supporters. Support for Maidan was provided only in the western regions of Ukraine and among radical youth. There was no need to talk about any support of the people. The violent actions of the opposition and the courage of Ukrainian law enforcement officers led to a change in public opinion. Yatsenyuk, Klitschko and Tayagnabok were forced to make concessions under pressure from their western handlers. Since administrative buildings began to be vacated, the authorities announced an amnesty, and the Russian Minister of Finance announced the provision of another tranche in the amount of $2 billion. And suddenly everything changed. It changed in one day. The West realized that a completely failed orange scenario and a change in public opinion could jeopardize all plans for the victory of the next Yushchenko, that is, a Western puppet, in the presidential elections in Ukraine in 2015, so it is necessary to act immediately. Now, even taking into account the fact that the militants were not 100% ready. And therefore, between the deflated Maidan and the attempt to seize power by force, there was no pause for the rest of 2014. Partners from the West, seeing their loss in the orange scenario, decided to reset the pieces on the board. Since they were initially preparing to seize power by 2015, they improvised on the knee, as they say. And they were not ready for a violent scenario. And a power grip is also obtained on the knee. They are not ready, for example, for a harsh response from the authorities now, just as they were not ready for its absence during the Maidan. But time pressure and Zugzwang, two states in which today's partners find themselves, dictate to them a choice between defeat or complete chaos. They chose chaos. But this chaos itself suggests that Maidan as an orange technology has already lost. The march to the Verkhovna Rada announced by the opposition right before our eyes turned into an attempt to seize power by force, the pretext for which was the unexpected desire of the West and its puppets in Ukraine to change the constitution, depriving the president of a significant part of his powers. Please note, while President Yanukovych was talking about the need for European integration, no one made any attempts to change the constitution, because the West was quite happy with the head of Ukraine signing an enslaving agreement with the European Union. As soon as Yanukovych refused to sign this document, the opposition immediately became inflamed with the desire to take away some of his powers. It's hard to call it politics, it's pure politicking. Unfortunately, soldiers of the internal troops, police officers and ordinary citizens of the country are paying for this politicking and direct betrayal of the interest of Ukraine. The coup d'etat scenario has not changed for centuries. This is a forceful seizure of key points of power. Yesterday's attempt to break through to the Verkhovna Rada, which resulted in the death of several people, was an attempted coup. The intensity of passions was completely unusual even for recent events in Ukraine. Never before have radical militants been willing to kill. The response to an attempted coup should be strict compliance by the authorities with their duties, namely the harsh suppression of any attempts to seize and usurp power, which in any country are a grave criminal offense. Unfortunately, there are no miracles in politics. If you turn a blind eye to the activities of pro-Nazi organizations and militant camps in the country for many years, if you allow torchlight processions and marches of banda raids in the center of the capital, this cannot end well. Alas, the classic of Russian literature was not mistaken in his assessment of politics. The Nazi abscess in Ukrainian politics will not resolve by itself. It needs to be cleaned out and treated. Once again, I would like to express my condolences to the families and friends of those killed in Ukraine, and wish fortitude and courage to the Ukrainian security forces and government officials. Kiev. Maidan. Unknown snipers. February 20, 2014. The attempted coup, which we see today in Ukraine, requires sacred sacrifices. Since the police and Bakot do not use firearms, this resulted in a very uncomfortable situation. Policemen were killed, random people were killed, like a correspondent for the Vesti newspaper, but among the militants there were no casualties related to the shooting of law enforcement officers. The revolution turns out to be strange, mostly only the defenders of order were killed. Although, strangely enough, this always happens. After all, law enforcement agencies carry out orders, and the militants are free in their actions, and their most radical part is not controlled by anyone at all. But for a coup d'etat, you need a picture. The government is supposedly shooting at the people. We need victims, we need the death of protesters. An attempt to blame the authorities for shooting snipers of the authorities was made during coups d'etat, Libya, Syria, Egypt, Kyrgyzstan, Moscow in 1993. In Kiev, during the confrontation on Grushevsky Street, Euromaidan actively disseminated 10-year-old photos from Kyrgyzstan, passing them off as current photographs of Bakot snipers. These are all old tricks. I have written about this countless times. But the West acts the same way all the time. The principle is this. Unknown snipers appear on the rooftops. These are employees of Western intelligence services. In 1993 in Moscow, they shot at people directly from the roof of the US Embassy. 15. The task of these scoundrels is to kill. Kill protesters, kill police officers, kill bystanders. They shoot in all directions. 16. The authorities will be blamed for the deaths of protesters and militants, and the militants will be blamed for the deaths of police officers. Random passers-by, preferably young girls, will add fuel to the fire. Their deaths will also be blamed on the authorities, who actually prohibit firing firearms. 17. The ultimate goal is mass clashes with a mass of victims, after which the United States and its allies will be able to put pressure on Yanukovych, who is killing people and has crossed the line. Further, options are possible, from Libyan to Syrian. But for any development of events, there must first be unknown snipers who will kill people. The revolution needs sacred victims, unknown snipers shoot at militants. Western media are helping to inflame passions. Some people kill, others create the necessary emotional background. During the morning fighting in the Maidan Independence area, 22 people were killed, the BBC reports. Oppositionists claim that 13 people were killed by a sniper shooting from the roof of one of the adjacent buildings. All the dead activists, men aged about 20, suffered targeted wounds to the chest or neck. From the Maidan stage they report that on Institutskaya Street, as well as on Grushevsky Street, there are snipers on the roofs who shoot to kill. It has not yet been possible to eliminate them. 16. The authorities have no sense in the death of 30 militants. No point. It is necessary to eliminate the entire source of tension and not anger the rioters. Not sniper rifles, but machine guns are used if they want to disperse a crowd. Shooting at the police is carried out in the same way by unknown snipers. Its purpose is somewhat different. Not to kill policemen, but to maim and wound. So that they too are angry and full of rage, and the Ukrainian authorities decide on the most severe scenario that the United States needs for further actions. Law enforcement agencies previously reported a sniper attack. According to official information from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, 1 policeman was killed and 29 were injured. The use of weapons in the Maidan area caused the retreat of special forces and internal troops. 17. Who is this sniper who wounded 29 people? Bad. Or, on the contrary, very good, his task is precisely to wound policemen. And here comes shooting at random people, journalists. The death of a journalist, especially a Western one, will set the right tone for the entire Western press. And the sniper opens fire. But it is not clear what kind of channel his victims represent. And the channel turns out to be Russian. The journalist was saved by wearing a bulletproof vest. Producer of the Rupli video agency Daniil Anisimov came under fire while covering armed clashes on the Maidan in Kiev. The journalist was in the lobby of the 14th floor of one of the central hotels when he was shot from a firearm through a window. The live bullet hit Anisimov's body armor, passing tangentially, and hit the television camera of the film crew. According to Anisimov, it is unknown where the shot was fired from. 18. Take care of yourself. Don't let them make you cannon fodder in Washington's game for control of Ukraine. The driving forces of the coup in Ukraine: betrayal, blackmail, unknown snipers. February 23, 2014. Unknown snipers killed about 3 dozen people in the capital of Ukraine. Provocateurs from Western intelligence services killed police officers, Maidan militants, and random passers-by in order to inflame passions. The goal is a coup d'état. Coup by force. While some of the protesters and the police beat each other with batons and defended themselves with shields, someone shot people in cold blood. Who is this? This is not difficult to understand. All the mechanics of the coup are evident. The killings of people by unknown snipers, who were actually planted on the roofs of Kiev by Western intelligence services, provide an opportunity to accuse the authorities of violence and start using violence against the authorities. Western and Western-controlled Ukrainian media are picking up the provocation and shaping public opinion in the West and Ukraine. This is a multi-step game in which the opposition, Western authorities and intelligence services and independent media are leading one bloody round dance. What happened? Immediately after the end of the Maidan, that is, the orange scenario, when the authorities gave an amnesty to the militants, and they, in turn, cleared most of the buildings, the opposition led by the West began a coup d'état. The militants began an attack on the police. This was necessary to create chaos and a situation in which unknown snipers would start shooting. We need corpses, we need blood. Therefore, militant commanders send their soldiers to be slaughtered, and unknown snipers they start shooting. Immediately, videos began to be distributed on the internet in which one can see a Habakkuk shoots. New? Nothing new. The internet is full of videos where the troops of bloody Gaddafi are shooting at the people. The troops of the bloody Bashar Assad are shooting at the people. President Mubarak's troops are shooting at the people. Now they have added videos in which Yanukovych gave the order to shoot at the people. The connection is obvious, the scenario is the same. These are provocateurs and stage videos. Further events develop as follows. After the murder of people by unknown snipers, pressure is put on Yanukovych. The West insists that it is responsible for the blood. The solution is simple: give up. And Yanukovych, apparently, wavered. In his interview, which he gave in Kharkov, he talks about security guarantees from Western mediators. Some of Yanukovych's associates betray him and Ukraine by running over to the side of the putschists. And Yanukovych said this in an interview. The driving forces of the coup in Ukraine: betrayal, blackmail, snipers. The opposition plan, but in fact the US plan, further developed as follows. 18. The police are withdrawn from the Maidan. It will unlock. The mayor of Kiev betrays Yanukovych. 19. Next, the government quarter is taken under control by militants. Now the coup can be legitimized. 20. There are not enough opposition deputies to make decisions. Deputies from the Party of Regions are bought, threatened, beaten in order to gain a quorum. Some people simply vote for them, although these people are not in the radar, and they even have the voting card. 21. The purpose of voting is to change the constitution. This is necessary in order to take away Yanukovych's powers. This is the appointment of security ministers to take control of forces and structures and not allow the coup to be suppressed. 22. Yanukovych is losing ground. What they told him, what they threatened him with, we will most likely never know. 23. By agreeing to early elections, he falls into a trap. Having surrendered all power, he can no longer influence the course of events. 24. In the radar, they beat the speaker from the Party of Regions and threatened him into resigning. Who saw this statement? Was it there? A new speaker is appointed. This is necessary in order to set the date for new presidential elections instead of Yanukovych. 25. The Rada changes the article of the criminal code, and Tymoshenko is released. Please note, the same Rada was unable to make a decision in November 2013 to change the law so that she could go to Germany for a treatment. And now the same deputies simply released her. A quick multi-step according to the scenario of February 1917, the creation of a new government. First the rebellion, then its legitimization through the new Rada, in February 1917, the provisional government. The conditions for this coup d'etat are the obligatory betrayal of part of the elite and the criminal softness of the country's leader. Yanukovych was obliged to suppress the coup and had every opportunity to do so. But he wavered, and immediately, the next day, the West carried out the entire scenario described above. What can I say about this? In 1941, the Nazis captured Kiev. In November 1943, he was released. Let us not lose our presence of mind and faith in the strength of our people. 19. Why Yanukovych lost power and would there be a split in Ukraine? February 24, 2014. Every genre of art has its own name. There is opera, there is ballet, there is operetta, etc. In the same way, political genres have their own clear and precise names. There is electoral democracy, there is dictatorship, there is monarchy. And the methods of obtaining power also have definitions. There is a legitimate victory in elections, a legitimate inheritance of the throne. And there is a coup d'etat. This is when a change of power occurs with violence against the previous government. What happened in Ukraine is called a coup d'etat. President Yanukovych was removed from power by parliamentary decree, the Speaker of the Rada resigned, sent. The constitution was changed, the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs was replaced, government buildings are guarded by militants, not police, a number of laws were repealed, all this happened in just a couple of days. The reason was, first peaceful protests, then beatings and fights with law enforcement officers, then the murders of police officers and civilians. Then the militants took control of the authorities, and the Rada began churning out laws, in the language of Russian liberals, like a mad printer. Violence as a way to gain power. What can all this be called? Coup d'etat. Classics of the genre. Now that we have defined what happened, let's figure out how this became possible and what we can now expect. The West's first reaction to Yanukovych's failure to sign an association agreement with the EC was the organization of the Maidan. Peaceful protest, talk of a stolen dream, all this was just a cover for the West's attempt to put pressure on Yanukovych in order to change his position and sign the agreement. As a result, Brussels should have received the actual right to govern Ukraine economically and politically. President Yanukovych, who has been talking about European integration for almost 4 years, suited the West quite well, and no one in Europe spoke about corruption, illegitimacy, or reproached him with his luxurious residence in the vicinity of the capital. As soon as Yanukovych refused to sign, events moved rapidly. Soon all the protesters had already forgotten about European integration and began to demand the resignation of the president. I will not now recall in detail all the milestones of the confrontation, which led to human casualties. Now about something else, about the main thing. The orange scenario of a peaceful seizure of power, which worked in 2004, did not work in 2014. The peaceful protest was stopped by peaceful police resistance. The burning Bakut members and internal troops not only stopped the orange scenario, but also reduced it to defeat, showing the true face of the peaceful protesters. Why was Yanukovych, who lost so mediocrely in a matter of days in February 2014, able to hold out in November-January? Because during the orange scenario, he had good advisors. Officially, Russia did not interfere in any way in the conflict in Ukraine, and this is the correct position. But ask yourself, would you lend $15 billion to someone without guarantees that the policy for which you are lending money will be maintained? And $3 billion? Hardly. And Russia was ready to lend to Ukraine precisely in order to maintain a certain political course, just as the West refused to allocate loans for this political course. So, there is no reason to consider Vladimir Putin a naive politician. This means that the Russian leadership was simply obliged to allocate advisors to Yanukovych. to be able to suggest steps that will help him retain power and maintain the political vector that was set by the refusal to sign an enslaving agreement with the EC. The entire orange scenario Yanukovych moved in the wake of the suggested actions. And he practically won against the opposition. On February 17, 2014, the authorities gave an amnesty to the participants of the riots, were able to stop and prevent accusations of excessive violence. The oppositionists unsuccessfully tried to hang 2 corpses on Grushevsky from the Bakhmut, negotiate the liberation of the seized buildings, and they actually began to be liberated. So that the oppositionists could present something as their successes, Yanukovych only promised to hold elections in December 2014, and not in the spring of 2015, which in fact was not important for him, and gave the opposition the opportunity to present any or success. Although now you can ask them, what, the elections in May 2014, almost a year earlier than according to the law, cost hundreds of human lives and hundreds of crippled citizens of the country. And then the following happened, the orange scenario ended, Maidan 2014 ended. And immediately the coup d'etat began. The results seemed uninteresting to the states, feeling that Yanukovych could defeat any of their candidates in the presidential elections, and Yulia Tymoshenko is still in prison. And they gave the go-ahead to a forceful attempt to seize power. On February 18, the peaceful march to the Roda turned into a massacre with many killed and many wounded. The militants burned down the office of the Party of Regions and openly killed people there, something they had never done before. How should the government respond to the violence? Adequately. Just as the peaceful protest was defeated by the standing of the Bakhmut, the violent coup d'etat had to be eliminated by the actions of the Bakhmut. That's how it was at first. In a matter of minutes, not even hours, the militants were driven into an encirclement, the metro was stopped, and the entrances to Kiev were blocked. All that remained was to restore order with a strong hand. The opposition provided a reason and a picture for this. This would be a complete victory, and, as we know, winners are not judged. They would try the leaders of the opposition who called on people to disobey the authorities, create illegal armed groups, seize government institutions, etc. On the evening of February 18th, Klitschko and Yatsenyuk were confused and depressed. But President Yanukovych did not give an order to liquidate the rebellion. The security forces did not wait for the order. Yanukovych wavered. And he began to negotiate with the opposition and Western emissaries. Yanukovych began his favorite game of 2 sides, both ours and yours, and this led him to the loss of power. Yanukovych chose money, guarantees of his personal safety and the safety of his billionaire son, and betrayed everyone who fought on the side of the law against the putschists. He himself told himself about the guarantees he received personally in his infamous interview. He didn't even have the sense not to talk about it on camera. The presence of money stored in Western banks, where else can billions be stored, and a son tied to the Western financial system, led Yanukovych to capitulation. He did not risk fighting the attempt to overthrow him using harsh methods appropriate to the situation, and decided to maintain a handshake for the West. He no longer listened to any advice. He betrayed Ukraine. And he was deceived by the West, just as Gaddafi, Hussein, Milosevic and many others were deceived. When the authorities stopped resisting, the coup d'etat instantly won, after which in a matter of hours Yanukovych lost all power and everything he had, including his beloved residence. This is about the question what happened. Now let's talk about how the situation may develop. A coup d'etat always calls itself a legitimate government. And if there is no other legitimate authority, he finally becomes a legitimate authority. Will there be a split in Ukraine? In today's situation it will not exist. Because for a split you need 2 centers of power. And today there is only one, the former putschist in Kiev. To counter the coup d'etat, a new center of power is needed, which 26 would declare, and there is every reason for this, the Roda to be an illegitimate government, and all its decisions, made under the threat of militants, are insignificant. Elections in May will not be held in the same way, since the decision to hold them is illegal. 27. He will announce that the legitimate president is Viktor Yanukovych, who, like it or not, must serve his presidential term until December, when legitimate elections will be held. and transfer power to the new president of Ukraine. 28. And this center of power, speaking on behalf of the legal President Yanukovych, will be ready to subjugate law enforcement agencies, the army, and create self-defense forces in the entrusted areas. Without the emergence of a second center of power, there will be no split in Ukraine. They do not fight a coup d'etat with rallies and pickets. This orange scenario is stopped by a counter-rally, and a violent seizure of power can only be stopped by the creation or maintenance restoration of another legitimate center of power. In the near future we will see whether such a center of power will appear, whether such a personality will appear, since Yanukovych himself is not capable of this. Until such a center of power begins to take shape, there will be no split in Ukraine. Until the emergence of this second legitimate center, all talk about help from Russia is a provocation. Because Russia, unlike the West, today does not have a center of power that can be helped. The existing center of power has withdrawn itself, there is no new one. Russia can help the emerging center of power, but it cannot create it. The West did not create a Western opposition center, it only helped it and pumped it with resources. An obstetrician can help you give birth, but he cannot help you conceive. Without the emergence of this new center of power, any actions by Russia will be declared an occupation, and we risk being drawn into an unpredictable military conflict, which is what our American partners need. They failed to light the fire of a serious military conflict in Syria and will be happy if it appears on the territory of Ukraine. The government that gives the title of hero for killing law enforcement officers will not last long. February 25, 2014. Any coup d'etat that wins has the same dramaturgy. Those who honestly served the law and kept their oath become outcasts and enemies. Those who broke the law and tried to seize power by force, on the contrary, become heroes. This is what happened in February 1917. Policemen were killed, gendarmes and officers were killed and maimed. And the peaceful demonstrators of that time who died in street battles, plus everyone who was found in the morgues who died for reasons unrelated to the revolution, were declared victims of the revolution and buried in the center of Petrograd, on the Champ de Mars. Today we see that the new government of Ukraine, whose dubious legitimacy is stained with the blood of faithful servants of the law, is following exactly this path. News 1. February 24, 2014. The Verkhovna Rada adopted a resolution to award the title Hero of Ukraine to the deceased participants in the protest. The resolution provides for an appeal to the next president of Ukraine with a proposal to posthumously award the title Hero of Ukraine to fallen civilian participants in armed conflicts during peaceful protests during November 2013 to February 2014. The resolution comes into force from the moment of its adoption, 20. I hope that the next president of Ukraine will be smart enough not to do this. Indeed, as of today, all peaceful demonstrators have been given an amnesty, which means that the deaths, injuries and mutilations of police officers and soldiers of the internal troops, who honestly followed orders and remained faithful to the oath, will not be investigated and punished. Those who remain faithful to the oath deserve the title of hero, and not those who broke the law, hiding behind beautiful words. At the same time, the overwhelming majority of killed militants and bystanders were killed by unknown snipers, that is, employees of Western intelligence services and provocateurs from among peaceful demonstrators, corpses shot in the back of the head, at point-blank range. News 2. Who is responsible for the Ukrainian economy, which was on the verge of death due to the coup d'etat? Its organizers, the organizers of the Maidan. Before the Maidan, before the fighting, there was no catastrophe. There was a slow decline of the Ukrainian economy due to the unnatural severance of ties with the economies of other parts of the Russian world. The Maidan began, and the economy collapsed. The coup d'etat began on February 18th, and it collapsed. What is the new government with questionable legitimacy going to do? Borrow. To finally enslave Ukraine in the clutches of Western creditors. But Yanukovych was also going to take it. Yes, but completely different amounts and in a calm environment. Russia planned to lend Ukraine $15 billion in several installments. How much do the revolutionaries need? The new authorities estimated the planned volume of macrofinancial assistance needed by the country in 2014 to 2015 at $35 billion. And about. Finance Minister Yuri Kolobov proposed holding an international donor conference with the participation of EU countries, the USA and other states, representatives of the IMF and international financial organizations to allocate assistance for the modernization of the state. 21. For reference, Ukraine's budget in 2013 was less than $50 billion. If you borrow from what you already have, Ukraine will fall into eternal bondage to the United States, the European Union and the IMF. Also for reference, as of April 2013, Ukraine's national debt was almost $70 billion. And now the dashing boys propose to increase the country's national debt immediately, in one sitting, by 50%. The thinking of real statesmen is evident. Or are they temporary workers who are going to grab it and run away to Berlin, London and Brussels? I wonder who will guarantee that no one will steal this borrowed money, and that the people of Ukraine will not pay off this colossal debt for centuries. Let's summarize. Ukraine, which is being built by the authors of the coup d'etat, looks like this. The title of a hero is for something that requires a long prison sentence. For real heroes, nothing or persecution. Increasing debt, that is, bondage, at an accelerated pace. How long will such a society and such power last? Is the new government of Ukraine legitimate? February 27, 2014. Today I want to talk about legality. To what extent can we even talk about this against the backdrop of the coup d'etat in Ukraine? But let's imagine for a moment that everything happened as many Ukrainian and Western media imagine today. Desperate people came and overthrew the hated government. And then the intimate process of forming a new government begins. How consistent is what is happening in Ukraine now with the Constitution of Ukraine? First, about the realities of life, militants go to meetings of regional parliaments with machine guns in their hands. This is no longer a secret, the video is easy to find on the internet. One of the people's deputies of the Rada, whose name I will not mention for obvious reasons, said that he personally saw such a picture in the Rada hall. Several people with machine guns entered the hall where the session was taking place, were called aside and President of Ukraine Tachinov and thoughtfully explained something to him. Like this. Let me remind you that the parliament is guarded by self-defense forces, that is, the same militants. How can there be any free expression of the will of deputies here? Why did some deputies from the Party of Regions and Communists suddenly vote for laws that they had previously refused to vote for? Pressure, threats to the family, threats to burn down the house. Some houses in Kiev have already been burned, some apartments have been looted. It was under such conditions that the new Rada gained votes. Let's take a closer look at a process that is considered the basis of any democracy, like voting. How do they vote in the Rada now? That's how. The speaker announces that such and such a project with such and such a number is being voted on. The text is not distributed to anyone, there are no preliminary readings or discussions at all. Vote right away. I repeat, no one sees the text. Peaceful protesters are walking in the courtyard and outside the voting hall. As we see, they go not only with shields and clubs. Although the club is not exactly a democratic instrument. This is exactly how all the most important decisions were voted on, which recorded the seizure of power by oppositionists and militants. Many deputies were never seen in the hall, although according to the voting results they seem to have voted for. In particular, from the Communist Party. How so? Yes, it's very simple, they simply took their card and pressed the buttons for them, 22. But quite recently, those who today thus churn out the decisions they need for themselves, were categorically against this method. Exactly a year ago, in February 2013, at the insistence of the opposition, the Verkhovna Rada adopted a law prohibiting voting for yourself and for that guy. Here is information about this, http://cn.ua/politics/verichovinaia-roda-protfor-protfor-nopkodavstv-1174870_html. But nevertheless, the former opposition, and now the new government, calmly voted for all the absent deputies. How principled Ukrainian journalists looked just a year ago, when they organized flash mobs and protests against voting in the Rada for that guy. How fiercely they argued that every deputy should vote for himself. Hey, you are our principled people, where are you now? All Saturday, seemingly faithful voting took place in Parliament, or in what was left of it, and no one grabbed anyone by the hand, no one shouted, vote specially. Or, nobody needs it anymore. Is revolutionary expediency already ruling? In the morning, a crowd of bearers of European values beat up MP Grushevsky, who was trying to leave Parliament. In the afternoon, his card is voted on. This is free voting, right? And who saw Pyotr Simonenko, Alexander Golob, and other deputies from the Communist Party of Ukraine in the hall? In the communist seats, you can see it in the photo, a maximum of 7 to 8 people sat all day. Moreover, I'm not sure that there were any deputies from the Communist Party of Ukraine there at all, except for Martinyuk. It was difficult to recognize anyone there. But look at the voting results. More than 30 members of the Communist Party faction each regularly voted for the appointment of Turchinov, and for the release of Tymoshenko, and for the removal of Yanukovych, including Simonenko, Golob, and almost the entire faction who were absent from the hall. At the same time, Euromaidan militants destroyed the central office of the Communist Party of Ukraine. And do you want to say that communist deputies voted calmly in the Rada at that time? What's really there? More office, less office. After all, Turchinov must be elected. 23. Having figured out how people vote in the Rada after the coup, let's turn to how consistent the decisions made are with the Constitution of Ukraine. Not even the Constitution, but the constitutions. Since it was a question of returning to the old version of the basic law of Ukraine, in which the president has less powers. First, a little emotion, because today in Ukraine everything is filled with them, and not with the law. In order to somehow justify the overthrow of the legally elected President Yanukovych, the revolutionaries say that Yanukovych, who was elected under one constitution, lost his legitimacy when the old constitution was returned. Let's take this as a given and agree for a second. Then what do you call the parliament that returned the repealed constitution and the rights that it received with it? Radu was also not elected under this old constitution. In this logic, the parliament is not legitimate if the president is not legitimate. But today Ukraine is ruled not by logic or laws, but by revolutionary expediency. But we will still look at the constitution. Was it violated when the Rada declared President Yanukovych deposed and appointed? Oh, President. Here are a few excerpts from the Constitution of Ukraine, which was returned by the Constitutional Court, the one that was in force at the time of the coup, and in the 2004 edition, the old one, with reduced powers of the president. The Constitution of Ukraine in force at the time of the coup d'etat. Article 105. The President of Ukraine is vindicating the right of incompleteness for the hour of reinvalidation. For encroachments on the honor and integrity of the President of Ukraine, guilty individuals are subject to prosecution before the law. The title of the President of Ukraine is protected by law and is retained forever, unless the President of Ukraine is removed from office as a result of impeachment. 24. Article 105. The President of Ukraine enjoys the right of immunity for the period of execution of powers. For attacks on the honor and dignity of the President of Ukraine, the perpetrators are held accountable on the basis of the law. The title of the President of Ukraine is protected by law and is retained for life, unless the President of Ukraine has been removed from office by impeachment. 25. The Constitution of Ukraine, as amended in 2004, which the oppositionists so wanted and returned. Article 105. The President of Ukraine is vindicating the right of incompleteness for the hour of reinvalidation. For encroachments on the honor and integrity of the President of Ukraine, guilty individuals are subject to prosecution before the law. The title of the President of Ukraine is protected by law and is retained forever, as only the President of Ukraine has not been removed from office as a result of impeachment. Article 105. The President of Ukraine enjoys the right of immunity for the period of execution of powers. For attacks on the honor and dignity of the President of Ukraine, the perpetrators are held accountable on the basis of the law. The title of the President of Ukraine is protected by law and is retained for life, unless the President of Ukraine has been removed from office by impeachment. 26. As you can see, the text of the articles are identical. And they clearly say that the President remains President until he is removed as a result of impeachment. What is impeachment? This is a specific procedure for removing the President from power. Legal and clearly described in the Constitution, and not resulting from the seizure of Parliament by peaceful protesters, with or without small arms. Let's read the Constitution of Ukraine further. How is impeachment carried out? After all, only as a result of this procedure can President Yanukovych be removed from power and appointed. This position. And without removing the President, it is absolutely impossible to arrest and try him on legal grounds. Article 111. The President of Ukraine may be removed from his post by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine by way of impeachment if he has committed any wrongdoing against the state. The story about the removal of the President of Ukraine from his post as a result of impeachment is largely due to the constitutional structure of the Supreme Council of Ukraine. To carry out the investigation, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine creates a special time-hour investigation commission, which includes a special prosecutor and special investigators. The findings and proposals of the hourly investigative committee are considered at the meeting of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. For the evidence of fraud, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, no less than 2/3 of its constitutional nature, makes a decision about the calling of the President of Ukraine. The decision on the removal of the President of Ukraine from office by way of impeachment is accepted by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine at least 3/4 of the time after the review of the document by the Constitutional Court of Ukraine and its annulment. His prosecution to maintain the constitutional procedure for investigation and consideration of impeachment proceedings and to withdraw the prosecution to the Supreme Court of Ukraine about those whose actions include the President of Ukraine are taking away the signs of the state for the sake of harm or other evil. Article 111. The President of Ukraine may be removed from office by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine by impeachment if he commits high treason or another crime. The issue of removing the President of Ukraine from office through impeachment is initiated by a majority of the constitutional composition of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. To conduct the investigation, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine creates a special temporary investigative commission, which includes a special prosecutor and special investigators. The conclusions and proposals of the temporary investigative commission are considered at a meeting of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. If there are grounds, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, with at least 2/3 of its constitutional composition, decides to accuse the President of Ukraine. The decision to remove the President of Ukraine from office by way of impeachment is made by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine by at least 3/4 of its constitutional composition after examining the case by the Constitutional Court of Ukraine and receiving its conclusion regarding compliance with the constitutional procedure for investigating and considering the case of impeachment and receiving the conclusion of the Supreme Court of Ukraine on that the acts of which the President of Ukraine is accused bear signs of high treason or another crime. So, the Constitution of Ukraine clearly describes the mechanism of impeachment. A few clarifications: there are 450 deputies in the Rada. The constitutional majority is 338 people's deputies. If we are not talking about the need for a constitutional majority, then 226 votes are enough to make a decision. Now let's do the analysis. 29. The President, the Constitution of Ukraine tells us, can be removed from office only as a result of the impeachment procedure. Whatever crime he committed, any other way is a gross violation of the fundamental law. Only impeachment or nothing at all. 30. To carry out the impeachment procedure, at least 226 deputies must initiate the creation of a special investigative commission, which includes a special prosecutor and special investigators. 31. Next comes the investigation, and the findings are considered by the Rada. Then 300 deputies must vote to indict the President. 32. Finally, at least 338 deputies can vote to impeach the President and remove him from power. But only after checking the case by the Constitutional Court of Ukraine and receiving its conclusion regarding compliance with the constitutional procedure for the investigation and consideration of the impeachment case and receiving the conclusion of the Supreme Court of Ukraine that the acts of which the President of Ukraine is accused bear signs of high treason or other crimes. It is easy to see that nothing required by the Constitution was done. This means 4. There was no impeachment. The Rada voted for the removal of Yanukovych by 328 votes. That is, less than 338, 3/4 of 450. 5. Yanukovych continues to be the only legitimate head of Ukraine. All talk about his loss of legitimacy is speculation and emotion. They have no connection with legal actions. Whether you like or not like Yanukovych is a matter of personal attitude. Until legal elections and the selection of a new head of the country, he is the president. 6. All decisions of the oppositionists who seized power, starting with the removal of Yanukovych, are 100% illegal. This is a crime under the most serious articles of the Criminal Code. Usurpation of power, armed rebellion, etc. 7. The decision to hold elections in May, made by the Rada, is just as illegal. 8. All appointments and President Turchinov is illegal, all decrees and orders are invalid. And lastly, the turnovers understand the complete violation of the law. Therefore, they urgently liquidate and transform the body that alone has the right to determine whether the Constitution has been violated. This is the Constitutional Court. 24.02, 2014. The new authorities of Ukraine decided to dismiss the judges of the Constitutional Court. The corresponding resolution was adopted at a meeting on February 24 by the Verkhovna Rada, which came under the control of opponents of President Viktor Yanukovych. The deputies, as noted by comments, accused members of the Constitutional Court of violating the oath. The basis for the charges was that the judges overturned the constitutional reform in 2010. By decision of the Rada, 5 judges of the Constitutional Court, appointed under the parliamentary quota, were dismissed. In addition, the Rada proposed to the acting president, Speaker of Parliament, oppositionist Alexander Turchinov was recently appointed interim president, and the Congress of Judges to dismiss their representatives in this judicial body. What is the way out of the situation? Yanukovych must return to his duties and, together with the deputies, restore order in the country. The Rada must begin impeachment proceedings and at the same time recognize the unconstitutionality and illegality of almost all of its decisions since the coup. Cancel all appointments that have been made and President Turchinov and his appointees. After this, a new election date must be set, which will be approved by all parties to today's conflict. Like that. I am convinced that lawyers will describe this part much better and more accurately. Is all this possible? Hard to tell. But if Ukraine wants to remain within the legal framework and avoid splits and tensions fraught with blood, there is no other way. In the meantime, what happened in Ukraine can only be called a coup d'état. That is, one of the most serious crimes according to the classification of any state. Who created the right sector in Ukraine? March 3, 2014. The far-right organization, Right Sector, became known during the coup d'état in Ukraine, when militants replaced the truly peaceful demonstrators of the early Maidan on the streets of Kiev. Instead of students with flowers, young men appeared not only with rebar and bats, but also with firearms. Who created Right Sector? Where did he come from? This is the fruit of many years of work. Whose? Lots of strength. Including Ukrainian security services. The video, which you can watch at the link http://instorikovi.ru/new/wp-content/upload/2014/03/383693947.jpg, shows who prepared the coup in Ukraine and told the militants to set fire to the Bakhmut. Came to visit the militants. Valentin Alexandrovich Nalyvaichenko is a very interesting figure. The biography is huge, you can read it on Wikipedia. I will recall only one episode. In June 2006, Nalyvaichenko was appointed to the position of first deputy chairman of the SBU, head of the Anti-Terrorism Center under the Security Service of Ukraine. From December 2006 to March 2010, he headed the Security Service of Ukraine and was a member of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. And in this capacity he came to visit the militants, the results of whose activities are seen today by the whole world. The SBU trained militants under Yushchenko. What were the contacts under Yanukovych? In conclusion, some news from recent days. The coup d'etat has taken place, appointments are being made. February 25, 2014. And now Valentin Alexandrovich Nalyvaichenko, a rather deputy from Vitaly Klitschko's Yuda party, is appointed head of the Security Service of Ukraine. Questions. 33. Is Vitaly Klitschko not to blame if there is such a deputy in his faction, with such connections? 34. What would the SBU turn into if its leader, appointed by the turnovers, is in such close contact with the militants? And in general, you will agree, there is much less fog about what happened in Kiev after watching videos like this. One team worked. Only everyone's roles in it are different. Some run for president, some raise militants, but everyone together is trying to hand over Ukraine into the hands of the West. Chapter 3. Russians. Polite. There. The return of Russia to big politics. Russia's policy towards Ukraine, questions and answers. March 11, 2014. Amid the ongoing political crisis in Ukraine, many questions arise, including with regard to how correct the position taken by Russia is, how correct Russia's actions are in the current situation. Let's try to answer these questions. Geopolitics is akin to a street fight, but only with certain rules. These rules are called international law. However, lately we have seen a clear trend in which the United States and some of its allies are moving towards the elimination of international law. We saw this in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, and most recently in Libya and Syria. What is a violation of international law? Support for illegitimate authorities, support for militants with weapons and money, attempts to resolve complex issues with brute force. We often hear talk that the United States and the West as a whole want to build partnerships with Russia. However, such relationships imply respect for each other's interests and refusal of steps that lead to unacceptable consequences for the other side. Violation of this rule immediately leads to a sharp escalation of the situation. A striking example is the US reaction to the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba and the subsequent Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world stood on the verge of a nuclear conflict between the USA and the USSR, the cause of which was Khrushchev's adventurous policy. The USSR brought missiles to Cuba, from where Florida is a few minutes away in the summer. The states could not tolerate this, and a sharp escalation of the situation began, which, fortunately, was soon ended with a compromise. Who is to blame for today's crisis? And were there any ways to avoid it? The US and Europe are to blame for the current crisis in Ukraine. It was not Russia that brought the situation to the point of complete violation of the Ukrainian constitution. It was not Russia that supported the militants. From the very beginning, Russia supported the legitimate government in Kiev, in whose elections it had nothing to do. Yanukovych's victory was not ensured in Moscow, it was ensured by the voters of Ukraine, who were tired of the orange. The West recorded the fairness of Yanukovych's victory in the fight for the presidency. Then the West began to work with Yanukovych and was quite pleased with him until the moment when he refused to sign an agreement on association with the EU. The meaning of the agreement was simple: the transfer of the sovereignty of Ukraine into the hands of the West. President Putin said that the further escalation of the situation was a kind of false start, that all these pogroms and fights were planned. Only for a slightly later period, for the presidential elections in Ukraine in the spring of 2015. The United States was going to bring its puppets into power in the 2015 elections, who were supposed to act as a liquidation commission for the economy and living standard of the population of Ukraine. The goals that the West sets and has set for itself on the territory of Ukraine are as follows. 35. The transformation of Ukraine into a zone of chaos in every sense, from economics to politics, with the rise of radical Russophobes to power. 36. Accusation of all the sins of Russia, followed by squeezing Russia out of Crimea in order to deprive it of a naval base. What is the consistent centuries-old policy of the Anglo-Saxons to contain Russia's sea power in the Black Sea and in the world's oceans as a whole? 37. The beginning of another attempt to change power in Russia according to the Maidan scenario with the participation of Ukrainians, who in the crowd will be 100% desperate Russians. The reference point is the Duma elections in 2016. It won't work, the second attempt during the presidential elections. 38. The ultimate goal is chaos in Russia, a military conflict between the new democratic Russia and totalitarian China, which is impossible under the current Russian government. The role of Ukraine in the Western scenario in this geopolitical battle is the role of a fagot in a fire. Territory, battlefield, means of starting a fire. Due to a sharp change in Yanukovych's position regarding the signing of the European Occupation Treaty, the West had to start ahead of time. The main thing we must understand from further events that led on February 21 to the signing of an agreement between Yanukovych and the opposition through the mediation of the West. 9. The West began destabilization in Ukraine by carrying out a real coup d'état with the hands of militants and corrupt politicians. 10. The West had every opportunity to carry out a peaceful change of power. Yanukovych actually surrendered power on February 21. If you wanted a peaceful and stable course of events, you just had to comply with these agreements. A government of agreement from different forces, disarmament of militants, elections in December 2014 with the opportunity for all political forces to conduct free campaigning. 11. Instead, the persecution of communists and the Party of Regents began, stamping out laws that violated the constitution, appointment, etc. O. President in violation of the law. And most importantly, the first laws of the New Order were the abolition of the status of the Russian language and the abolition of responsibility for promoting Nazism. The current cool Nazi militants are forces controlled from the West. Just remember how these irreconcilable fighters freed prisoners and buildings at the call of the US ambassador. If the Americans had demanded that they comply with the agreement and stop violence, everything would have come down, as if by magic. But the West, instead of disapproval, expressed support for the putschists. Why? Because the West does not need peace, it needs war. The scenario remains the same, only it plays out a year earlier. Let me emphasize once again that it was not Russia that stirred up the mess in Ukraine. Russia's accusations of supporting Yanukovych in his fight against the protest are not supported by anything. There is no evidence of this. Just screams and emotions. As a legitimate president, Yanukovych was obliged to suppress law-breaking protests using force and firearms. But he did not do this and thereby plunged the country into chaos, and the Americans and Europeans persuaded him to do just that. They gave guarantees, made promises, which they immediately broke. Russia's accusations of shooting snipers on the Maidan do not stand up to criticism at all. 1. There is not a single piece of evidence. 2. There is not a single logical justification for why this had to be done in this form, when snipers shoot at both demonstrators and police officers. 3. There is no explanation why the exact same sniping scenario has been carried out over the past few years in Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Kyrgyzstan and Thailand. Russia organized all this there too. There is such a concept in detective practice, a serial killer. This is when the criminal's handwriting matches. This gives grounds to consider several murders as one series, carried out by one maniac, and not by several scoundrels. Even if the crimes are committed in different cities of the country or in different countries. So, the shooting of unknown snipers is the serial killing of demonstrators, committed according to the same scenario by the same forces, in different countries. With the goal of bringing pro-American puppets to power. In this situation, Russia in its policy had to proceed from an understanding of the ultimate goal of the United States. It is important to understand that today there is a geopolitical confrontation between the United States and Russia, and Crimea and Ukraine are just the location of this collision. There is nothing to negotiate with the putschists in Kiev, they are puppets. But it is impossible to reach an agreement with the United States, because the United States does not want to take into account the interest of Russia. Her desire is to have a base in Crimea, a friendly government in neighboring Ukraine, and to see Ukraine itself prosperous, successful and peaceful. In this situation, not to support the legitimate authorities of Crimea, who received support, even if only verbal, from the legitimate President Yanukovych, meant for Russia to simply play along with the American scenario. And very quickly lose both Crimea and the fleet base, and even be drawn into a military conflict with militants in an extremely vulnerable position. In the position of being expelled from Crimea and not providing support to all speakers of Russian culture and the Russian language. Russia helped the legitimate government with diplomatic support, and is now helping financially. The bet has been made, we will not give up Crimea. Because surrendering Crimea will only worsen our position and lead to casualties and repression by the Nazis against civilians. But it will not lead to an end to tension, because the organizers of the crisis in the United States really need it. The story of 2008 is repeating itself in Ossetia. Then Russia, in the same way, did not have the opportunity not to react. The desire for peace in 2008 came through the harsh coercion of the aggressor by military means. The alternative was disastrous. Turning a blind eye to Saakashvili's actions meant losing all self-respect and causing a chain reaction of collapse in the North Caucasus. The current crisis in Ukraine is easy to solve. We need to return to the agreement of February 21st. And Russia constantly demands this. The West's reaction is zero. Because he does not need a solution to problems, but their increase. Therefore, Washington does not meet Russia halfway, but tries to increase pressure. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry issued a diplomatic ultimatum to his Russian colleague. The continued presence of the Russian military outside its deployment sites in Crimea leaves no diplomatic path to resolving the crisis, Kerry warned. 28. In this situation, today it is impossible for Russia to reverse without colossal geopolitical, domestic political and economic losses. Continuing to defend its interests will cost Russia much less than trying to reach an agreement with the United States at the expense of this very interest. From the US point of view, the best option now is to exert all possible pressure on Russia while simultaneously attempting to provoke a military clash on the borders of Crimea through provocations and other methods. And the West needs to do this before the referendum in Crimea. I really want to hope that the West and its puppets will not be able to provoke any violent clashes, but for this we need to be on guard. Holding a referendum with the likely expression of the will of the majority of Crimeans for annexation gives the Russian leadership an opportunity to have a whole arsenal of means. 7. Inclusion or non-inclusion of Crimea into Russia. 8. The Federation Council has already authorized the use of the army outside the country by the President of Russia, but over the past week he has not exercised this right. 9. Economic pressure on Ukraine and the West in all possible directions, cancellation of gas discounts, cessation of supplies in emergency situations, seizure of Western property in response to similar actions by the United States, etc. The chess game being played today has two sides as participants. This is Russia and the West. And, as you know, chess players' moves are determined not only by their own plans, but also by their opponent's moves. Reacting to your opponent's actions and respecting your own interest with your moves is the path to victory in this chess game. If one grandmaster, under the shouts and pressure of the other, begins to withdraw his pieces back, undoing the steps already taken, his defeat will only be a matter of time. Russians. Polite. There. March 3, 2014. You always need to see the main thing behind the stream of changing pictures and text. So let's talk about the main thing, putting aside emotions and flows of changing news. What is Russia protecting in the current situation around Ukraine? 4. Russia defends international law in Ukraine. This may sound surprising to some, but Russia today is the only country in the world that consistently defends international law in the form in which it was formed after the Second World War. With the support of China, yes. But it is Russia that demands simple and clear things from the international community. Implementation of agreements of international mediators, that is, Western states, to resolve the crisis in Ukraine. This means returning the situation to February 21st and strict implementation by all parties of the agreement signed then. Russia claims that the only legitimate president of Ukraine today is Viktor Yanukovych. Here, too, Russia takes a position that completely coincides with international law. Like it, don't like it, irrelevant. There is a constitution of Ukraine, and all actions must comply with it. According to the constitution, the only possible way to remove a president from power, no matter what he has done, is impeachment. There is no other. And the impeachment procedure was not only not followed, but was not even started. All further actions of Russia are aimed at ensuring law and order and stem from the first 2 points. The fact is that it is the violation of international law and laws in general that leads to further sad consequences. Russia defends a simple and clear principle: there are rules in the world by which the whole world lives, and all world politics are carried out according to these rules. Both in Syria and in Ukraine. You can't just say that someone has lost legitimacy and carry out a coup d'etat or start an armed struggle. And those who violate the constitution have no right to be recognized as legitimate authorities by anyone in the world. They cannot be recognized, they must be forced to return to the constitutional field. This is the approach of Russia and China. There is a second approach: if you accept it, the planet will turn into a jungle. The right of the strong to do any arbitrariness is the essence of this second approach. And no matter how you disguise it with articles and reports, the meaning does not change. The dilemma is always the same: can you break the law or not? After all, Dostoevsky wrote exactly about this in his Crime and Punishment, even though he was not talking about international laws. And from the principle of compliance with international law, on which we insist, the following conclusion follows. 5. Russia stands guard over human rights. Any lawlessness always leads to a violation of human rights. Violating international laws is the worst thing. Because of this, wars begin, and people are deprived of their main right, the right to life. Today in Ukraine, some of the citizens of this country find themselves in a situation where their right to life, the right to freedom of movement, the right to inviolability of home, the right to property, the right to freedom of religion, the right to freely speak their native language, and many other rights are under threat. Russia, demanding a return to the legal field and supporting the legitimate government and not recognizing the illegitimate government, protect all these rights of all citizens of Ukraine. Russia does not divide people into nationalities. Russia does not divide people into religious denominations and political views. Russia is ready to protect human rights for any person in Ukraine. For residents of Russia, residents of the western regions of Ukraine are exactly the same brothers as the residents of its eastern regions. Only those who have fallen under intoxicating propaganda. Russia does not pose any danger to residents of Ukraine of any nationality. People of more than 100 nationalities live peacefully in Russia. We have Russians, Ukrainians, Tatars, and all other peoples and nationalities whose representatives live in Ukraine. And no one in Russia is oppressed, no one is prevented from speaking their native language or learning their native culture. There is no need to be afraid of Russia. This is nothing more than propaganda of our common geopolitical enemies. The only thing Russia will never come to terms with is fascism. Russia protects the rights of all people, except those Nazi criminals who sow death and chaos. Russia's position is simple: criminals must be punished and constitutional order restored, and until this happens in Ukraine, Russia is ready to help the legitimate government restore this order. It is highly symbolic that Russia's current struggle for compliance with international law and respect for human rights is taking place around Crimea. As we remember, the post-war world was formed at the Yalta Conference, and today the struggle for compliance with these UN-cancelled rules of international politics, later confirmed by the Helsinki Agreements, is again taking place on Crimean soil. 6. Russia takes on the role of a magistrate. Civilization is now in Russia. A justice of the peace appeared next to the gendarme, unnoticed by him. And if the gendarme is the image of someone who carries out an order without asking about the usefulness, legality, and fairness of the order, then the magistrate is a new image of a country that takes on the mission of judging fairly, taking into account the interest of not only those who are strong, but everyone in general. Actually, this is the image of civilization. This is how civilization differs from non-civilization. Non-civilization is the right of might, and civilization is the might of right. In the non-civilization there is no place and no right to life for all those who are smaller and weaker. Civilization is where the majority protects those who are fewer and weaker for reasons of morality, not practical benefit. Civilization is now in Russia. There are many civilized people outside of Russia, but there are no centers of power ready to defend civilization. They are simply centers of power. Russians. Polite. There. All the oppressed people and peoples of the world can say this. Now, after Ukraine, they can. After Ossetia, many hoped for this. Ukraine no longer gave the world hope, but a chance. Crimea is ready for a referendum. March 15, 2014. This morning I flew to Simferopol. At the airport, customs officers and border guards in Ukrainian uniforms calmly carry out their work. There are no armed people in or around the airport. Everything in the city is absolutely calm. Only once did I see a reinforced outfit, a pair of golden eagles, traffic cops and Cossacks. Administrative buildings are guarded by Cossacks without weapons. On the streets of Simferopol there is ordinary everyday life. No tension is felt or observed. I asked my companions to give me the opportunity to see the polite people from the Crimean Self-Defense Forces. We started looking. The fact is that all the photographs of polite people in beautiful uniforms that were published in Russia were taken literally around the government house. Everything is in one area. There's no one there now. As I already said, the Cossacks are standing without weapons. As a last resort, with a whip. But I really wanted to say thank you to the polite people. And we found them. In two places, where Ukrainian military units are located on the streets of the city, right at the entrance, along the fence, several polite people are peacefully walking. As a person no less polite than them, I asked permission to take a photo with them. In one place they refused, in another the politeness was boundless, for which special thanks. Simferopol is completely ready for the referendum. No problems are seen or heard. On the street where polite people stand, passers-by simply walk by and cars drive by. No excitement and certainly no violence. Now we are waiting for the result of the expression of the will of the Crimeans. Referendum in Crimea. March 16, 2014. The referendum in Crimea is taking place calmly and within the framework of the law. Being in Simferopol, I have the opportunity to see with my own eyes the events taking place. This morning I came to two polling stations to see how the referendum voting was going on. There are no armed people anywhere in the polling stations. The entrance is guarded by vigilantes without any weapons. No one is putting any pressure on voters. The normal voting process is underway, as is usually the case in any election. There is only one difference, the excellent mood of those who came to the referendum. People smile welcomingly, you can feel the festive mood. The whole process is no different from the usual voting procedure. The ballot boxes are transparent. At each site there is a mandatory, select buffet with delicious pastries, which I did not fail to try personally. On the streets of Simferopol, ordinary everyday life goes on, however, the weather has worsened today, it was raining, and it even snowed at night. There are a large number of film crews and journalists in the city center. The Verkhovna Rada building is guarded by unarmed Cossacks. Cossacks protect public order near the central square of Simferopol, where a stage is installed and a concert is taking place. Now we are waiting for the official result of the referendum to be announced. Lessons from Crimea. March 17, 2014. The referendum in Crimea ended in a resounding victory. The victory of historical justice, non-violence, and unifying tendencies of the Russian world. However, for us, the results of the expression of the will of the Crimeans are an excellent reason to analyze the current situation. Changes always happen unnoticed. The world is changing faster than we can track. The day after the treacherous dissolution of the USSR, few people noticed the difference between yesterday and today. But several years will pass, and October 1993 will come in Moscow. Then the war in Chechnya. Transnistria. Blood. Falling living standards, increasing mortality. Another 10 years passed and blood was shed in riot-ridden Kiev in 2014. But everything that happened after the collapse of a single country is a direct consequence of that day of collapse. So it is today. The result of the referendum on March 16, 2014 in Crimea opened a new era in world politics. The struggle of civilizations begins. The struggle of ideologies is finally a thing of the past. Since 1991, some people in the world have become accustomed to acting as if they are alone in this world. During this time, the international community shrank to the opinion of 8 to 10 countries, which for some reason decided that they were the only standard of human existence. Today, the unipolar world is completely a thing of the past. Competition between civilizations begins again, and Russian civilization is again going to actively defend its identity and its interest. These interests are simple and understandable: the development of Russian civilization, its multinational culture, the protection and development of the Russian language as the main binding internal foundation. The rapid development of the situation in Ukraine led to a sharp change in the situation throughout world politics. Ukraine as a state found itself on the brink of death due to a coup d'etat carried out by pro-American forces in Kiev. And this tragic situation sharply aggravated the internal contradictions in Ukrainian society that existed throughout the years of independence. From the point of view of the confrontation of civilizations, these contradictions are not difficult to understand. The Ukrainian people are part of the Russian people, they are part of Russian civilization. This is felt by the majority of Ukrainians, as they say, genetically. The craving for Russia is a craving for oneself. Western civilization, for all its gloss and splendor, is alien. Every Russian, Ukrainian, Chechen, Tatar, etc. feels this when he comes to the West from Russia or Ukraine. Meanwhile, part of Ukraine, Western, wants to consider itself part of Western civilization. I won't argue whether this is true or not, it's not that important. Another thing is important: the West does not consider Ukraine part of its civilization. Ukraine is like a guy who intends to get married and sets a wedding date, but he has not received the girl's consent. The talk, Ukraine is Europe, is nothing more than beautiful slogans put forward by politicians to achieve their goals. Attempts to draw part of Russian civilization into some kind of civilizational fulfilled, that is, to tear Ukraine away from Russia, but not to take it to Europe, constantly tempting it there, led to the creation of internal gaps in the Ukrainian state. At the first serious crisis, a crack came to the surface, and the state began to crack at the seams. You cannot rape the genetic code of tens of millions of people without consequences. For 2 decades they were told that they were Ukrainians, that they must speak, write and think only in Ukrainian. Anyone who considered himself an ethnic Ukrainian did so. But those who considered themselves Russian or a person of another nationality felt violated. This was not the case in the USSR. Everyone learned both Russian and the national language. And there was no tension. Why? Because no one was dragged into a foreign civilization, and within the framework of Russian civilization, no one perceives Ukrainian or any other native language as something alien. This is organic and natural. Our civilization is multifaceted and multinational. But there were never any prohibitions on speaking or writing in one's native language. Prohibitions on national identity and genocide of peoples are all signs of Western civilization. Ukraine could not succeed as a state, because its elite kept telling the people about the European choice and pulled the country towards a foreign civilization, intending to tear it off alive. The result is obvious: Crimea chose reunification with Russia. I have never seen such a holiday and such joy as on the evening of March 16, 2014 in my life. Many other regions of Ukraine are actively demanding federalization and greater freedoms, or even a referendum on secession from Ukraine. A state that goes in the opposite direction from its roots is doomed to destruction. This is not the evil will of anyone, this is the story and the truth of life. The timing of death may vary, but it is inevitable. In the case of Ukraine, the coup d'etat in Kiev acted as a catalyst for further events. And we woke up in a new world. It is again multipolar. Now we are waiting for the decision of the Russian leadership regarding Crimea's request for annexation. This decision is being closely watched in Transnistria, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. He is listened to attentively in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. We are for peace. We are for peaceful competition of civilizations. Different civilizations, and that's why we are against globalization. And therefore we will no longer allow bearers of Russian culture and the Russian language to be bullied. We are only dangerous to rapists, robbers, and murderers. For everyone else, Russia brings peace, harmony, and tranquility. The opportunity to speak your native language, honor your ancestors, pray to God, as your ancestors bequeathed. Russia has returned to big politics, and Russia's main role and task has always been to maintain a balance of justice. But it is precisely justice that has become significantly less since 1991. How much is Crimea? A conversation with a liberal. March 21, 2014. The situation around the reunification of Crimea and Russia has finally put everything in its place in Russia's political palette. It became clear who is a patriot and who is only dressing up as a patriot, pursuing their goals, using appropriate rhetoric. The leaders of the opposition and some cultural figures in Russia have lost the last vestiges of respect from their compatriots. A striking illustration of this were the words of one Crimean who came up to me on the square of Simferopol during the popular rejoicing on the night of March 17 to 18th. What about Makarevich? The man asked me, next to whom stood 4 sons, a little smaller. Does he really not want us to become part of Russia? What happened to him? He's always been like this. Our oppositionist liberals have always been like this, always supporting the steps of the West and always opposing the steps of Russia. So the last argument of the liberals today is the assertion that the annexation of Crimea will cost Russia very dearly. In a financial sense. To be honest, I'm already used to the fact that liberals look at everything that happens around them through the prism of their wallet. They think in money, live in money, and measure everything in money. But the situation surrounding Crimea's entry into Russia turned out to be so typical that I consider it wrong not to speak out. Let's analyze the liberals' arguments. Crimea became part of Russia. Now Russia will have to spend money on pulling up the peninsula to the all-Russian level and invest in its development. Then, as always, there is a groan that these funds would be better spent on hospitals and schools or distributed to orphans and pensioners. The first thing I would like to note is that we know very well how the liberals cared for orphans and pensioners, orphans in the 90s, hungry pensioners who did not fit into the market. Constant calls from liberals to stop maternity capital payments and increase the retirement age. Today's liberal fascists, who have come to power in Ukraine, are just going to save on pensions and social benefits. They are going to increase the retirement age and stop funding sports clubs. That is, they are doing everything that liberals in Russia could not or did not have time to do. Therefore, conversations from a cannibal about human rights can only be considered as a way of mimicry and demagoguery. As for kindergartens, schools, and hospitals, we also saw liberals in the 90s built literally the entire country with kindergartens and clinics. It was impossible to walk or drive across Russia from general education schools and sports schools. Schools and child care centers were opening at every step. So, no, not like this. Not at all like that. And these people, who purposefully destroyed science and culture, demography and sports in their homeland, still dare to say something. But to say this to a liberal means he won't understand anything. He thinks in money, efficiency and profit. I'll try to explain in liberal language why Russia needs Crimea, and why Crimea needs Russia. At the same time, I would deliberately not use such incomprehensible categories for a liberal as solidarity with compatriots, the desire to help people of one's own culture and language, and a sense of justice towards those who are oppressed. 10. When you buy an apartment, you only bear expenses.